Book 2, The Family, Chapter 1. Religion was the constituent principle of the ancient family. If we transport ourselves in thought to those ancient generations of men, we find in each house an altar, and around this altar the family assembled. The family meets every morning to address its first prayers to the sacred fire, and in the evening to invoke it for a last time. In the course of the day, the members are once more assembled near the fire for the meal, of which they partake piously after prayer and libation. In all these religious acts, hymns which their fathers have handed down are sung in common by the family. Outside the house, near at hand, in a neighboring field, there is a tomb, the second home of this family. There, several generations of ancestors repose together. Death has not separated them. They remain grouped in this second existence and continue to form an indissoluble family. Between the living part and the dead part of the family, there is only this distance of a few steps which separates the house from the tomb. On certain days, which are determined for each one by his domestic religion, the living assemble near their ancestors. They offer them the funeral meal, pour out milk and wine to them, lay out cakes and fruits, or burn the flesh of a victim to them. In exchange for these offerings, they ask protection. They call these ancestors their gods and ask them to render the fields fertile, the house prosperous, and their hearts virtuous. Generation alone was not the foundation of the ancient family. What proves this is that the sister did not bear the same relation to the family as the brother, that the emancipated son and the married daughter ceased completely to form a part of the family, and in fine several other important provisions of the Greek and Roman laws that we shall have occasion to examine farther along. Nor is the family principle natural affection, for Greek and Roman law makes no account of this sentiment. The sentiment may exist in the heart, but it is not in the law. The father may have affection for his daughter, but he cannot will her his property. The laws of succession, that is to say, those laws which most faithfully reflect the ideas that men had of the family, are in open contradiction both with the order of birth and with natural affection. The historians of Roman laws, having very justly remarked that neither birth nor affection was the foundation of the Roman family, have concluded that this foundation must be found in the power of the father or husband. They make a sort of primordial institution of this power, but they do not explain how this power was established, unless it was by the superiority of strength of the husband over the wife and of the father over the children. Now, we deceive ourselves sadly when we thus place force as the origin of law. We shall see farther on that the authority of the father or husband, far from having been a first cause, was itself an effect. It was derived from religion, and was established by religion. Superior strength, therefore, was not the principle that established the family. The members of the ancient family were united by something more powerful than birth, affection, or physical strength. This was the religion of the sacred fire and of dead ancestors. This caused the family to form a single body, both in this life and in the next. The ancient family was a religious rather than a natural association, and we shall see presently that the wife was counted in the family only after the sacred ceremony of marriage had initiated her into the worship, that the son was no longer counted in it when he had renounced the worship or had been emancipated, that, on the other hand, an adopted son was counted a real son because, though he had not the ties of blood, he had something better, a community of worship, that the heir who refused to adopt the worship of this family had no right to the succession, and finally, that relationship and the right of inheritance were governed not by birth, but by the rights of participation in the worship, such as religion had established them. Religion, it is true, did not create the family, but certainly it gave the family its rules, and hence it comes that the constitution of the ancient family was so different from what it would have been if it had owed its foundation to natural affection. The ancient Greek language has a very significant word to designate a family. It is epistion, a word which signifies literally that which is near a hearth. A family was a group of persons whom religion permitted to invoke the same sacred fire and to offer the funeral repast to the same ancestors. Book 2, Chapter 2, Marriage. The first institution that the domestic religion established, probably, was marriage. We must remark that this worship of the sacred fire and of ancestors, which was transmitted from male to male, did not belong, after all, exclusively to man. Woman had a part in it. As a daughter, she took part in the religious acts of her father, as a wife, in those of her husband. From this alone we see the essential character of the conjugal union among the ancients. Two families live side by side, but they have different gods. In one, a young daughter takes a part from her infancy in the religion of her father. She invokes his sacred fire. Every day she offers it libations. She surrounds it with flowers and garlands on festal days. She asks its protection and returns thanks for its favors. This paternal fire is her god. Let a young man of the neighboring family ask her in marriage, and something more is at stake than to pass from one house to the other. She must abandon the paternal fire, and henceforth invoke that of her husband. She must abandon her religion, practice other rites, and pronounce other prayers. She must give up the God of her infancy, and put herself under the protection of a God whom she knows not. Let her not hope to remain faithful to the one while honoring the other, for in this religion it is an immutable principle that the same person cannot invoke two sacred fires or two series of ancestors. From the hour of marriage, says one of the ancients, the wife has no longer anything in common with the domestic religion of her fathers. She sacrifices at the hearth of her husband. Marriage is therefore a grave step for the young girl, and not less grave for the husband, for this religion requires that one shall have been born near the sacred fire in order to have the right to sacrifice to it. And yet he is now about to bring a stranger to this hearth. With her he will perform the mysterious ceremonies of his worship. He will reveal the rites and formulas which are the patrimony of his family. There is nothing more precious than this heritage, these gods, these rites, these hymns which he has received from his fathers, are what protect him in this life, and promise him riches, happiness, and virtue. And yet, instead of keeping to himself this tutelary power, as the savage keeps his idol or his amulet, he is going to admit a woman to share it with him. Thus, when we penetrate the thoughts of these ancient men, we see of how great importance to them was the conjugal union, and how necessary to it was the intervention of religion. Was it not quite necessary that the young girl should be initiated into the religion that she was henceforth to follow by some sacred ceremony? Was not a sort of ordination or adoption necessary for her to become a priestess of this sacred fire, to which she was not attached by birth? Marriage was this sacred ceremony, which was to produce these important effects. The Greek and Roman writers habitually designate marriage by a word indicative of a religious act. Pollux, who lived in the time of the Antonines, but who was well instructed in the ancient usages of his language, says that in ancient times, instead of designating marriage by its particular name, gamos, they designated it simply by the word telos, which signifies sacred ceremony, as if marriage had been, in those ancient times, the ceremony sacred above all others. Now, the religion that created marriage was not that of Jupiter, of Juno, or of the other gods of Olympus. The ceremony did not take place in a temple. It was performed in a house, and the domestic god presided. When the religion of the gods of the sky became preponderant, men could not help invoking them also in the prayers of marriage, it is true. It even became habitual to go to the temple before the marriage and offer sacrifices to these gods. These sacrifices were called the preludes of marriage, but the principal and essential part of the ceremony always took place before the domestic hearth. Among the Greeks, the marriage ceremony consisted, so to speak, of 3 acts. The first took place before the hearth of the father, engnis. The third before the hearth of the husband, telos. The second was the passage from the one to the other, pombi. 1. In the paternal dwelling, in the presence of the future bridegroom, the father, surrounded ordinarily by his family, offers a sacrifice. The sacrifice concluded, he declares, pronouncing a sacramental formula, that he gives his daughter to the young man. This declaration is absolutely indispensable to the marriage, for the young girl would not be able to go at once to worship at the hearth of her husband if her father had not already separated her from the paternal hearth. To enable her to adopt her new religion, she must be freed from every bond that attaches her to her first religion. 2. The young girl is carried to the house of the husband. Sometimes the husband himself conducts her. In certain cities, the duty of bringing her belongs to one of those men who, among the Greeks, were clothed with a sacerdotal character, and who were called heralds. The bride was usually placed upon a car. Her face was covered with a veil, and on her head was a crown. The crown, as we shall often have occasion to see, was used in all the ceremonies of this worship. She was dressed in white. White was the color of the vestments in all the religious acts. She was preceded by a torch, the nuptial torch. For the whole distance they sang around her religious hymns, whose refrain was Omen Omene. This hymn they called the hymeneal, and the importance of this sacred chant was so great that they gave its name to the whole ceremony. The bride dares not go of her own accord into her new dwelling. Her husband must take her and simulate a seizure by force. She must cry out, and the women that accompany her must pretend to defend her. Why this rite? Is it a symbol of the modesty of the bride? This is hardly probable. The moment for shame has not yet come, for what is now to take place is a religious ceremony. Was it not to mark more strongly that the wife, who was now to sacrifice to this fire, had herself no right there, that she did not approach it of her own free will, and that the master of the place and of the god introduced her by an act of his power? However this may be, after a feigned struggle, the husband raises her in his arms and carries her through the doorway, taking great care, however, that her feet do not touch the sill. What precedes is only a preparation, a prelude to the ceremony. The sacred act now commences in the house. 3. They approach the hearth. The wife is brought into the presence of the domestic divinity. She is sprinkled with the lustral water. She touches the sacred fire. Prayers are repeated. Finally, the husband and wife share between themselves a cake or a loaf. This sort of light meal, which commences and ends with a libation and a prayer, this sharing of nourishment in presence of the fire, puts the husband and wife in religious communion with each other and in communion with the domestic gods. The Roman marriage closely resembled that of Greece, and, like it, comprised 3 acts: traditio, deductio in domum, confarreatio. 1. The young girl quits the paternal hearth. As she is not attached to this hearth by her own right, but through the father of the family, the authority of the father only can detach her from it. The tradition is therefore an indispensable ceremony. 2. The young girl is conducted to the house of the husband. As in Greece, she is veiled. She wears a crown, and a nuptial torch precedes the cortege. Those about her sing an ancient religious hymn. The words of this hymn changed, doubtless with time, accommodating themselves to the variations of belief, or to those of the language, but the sacramental refrain continued from age to age without change. It was the word telasi. a word whose sense the Romans of Horace's time no more understood than the Greeks understood the word imene, which was probably the sacred and inviolable remains of an ancient formula. The cortege stops before the house of the husband. There the bride is presented with fire and water. The fire is the emblem of the domestic divinity. The water is the lustral water that serves the family for all religious acts. To introduce the bride into the house, violence must be pretended, as in Greece. The husband must take her in his arms and carry her over the sill without allowing her feet to touch it. 3. The bride is then led before the hearth, where the penates and all the domestic gods and the images of ancestors are grouped around the sacred fire. As in Greece, the husband and wife offer a sacrifice, pouring out a libation, pronouncing prayers, and eating a cake of wheaten flour, panis varias. This cake, eaten during the recitation of prayers, in the presence and under the very eyes of the domestic divinities, makes the union of the husband and wife sacred. Henceforth they are associated in the same worship. The wife has the same gods, the same rites, the same prayers, the same festivals as her husband. Hence this old definition of marriage which the jurists have preserved to us. Nuptiae sunt divini juris et humani communicatio, and this other, uxor socia humanae rei atque divinae. This is because the wife participates in the worship of the husband, this wife whom, according to the expression of Plato, the gods themselves have introduced into the house. The wife, thus married, also worships the dead, but it is not to her own ancestors that she carries the funeral repast. She no longer has this right. Marriage has completely detached her from the family, and has interrupted all the religious relations that she had with it. Her offerings she carries to the ancestors of her husband. She is of their family. They have become her ancestors. Marriage has been for her a second birth. She is henceforth the daughter of her husband, filiae loco, say the jurists. One could not belong to two families, or to two domestic religions. The wife belongs entirely to her husband's family, and to his religion. We shall see the consequences of this rule in the right of succession. The institution of sacred marriage must be as old in the Indo-European race as the domestic religion, for the one could not exist without the other. This religion taught man that the conjugal union was something more than a relation of the sexes and a fleeting affection, and united man and wife by the powerful bond of the same worship and the same belief. The marriage ceremony, too, was so solemn and produced effects so grave that it is not surprising that these men did not think it permitted or possible to have more than one wife in each house. Such a religion could not admit of polygamy. We can understand, too, that such a marriage was indissoluble, and that divorce was almost impossible. The Roman law did indeed permit the dissolution of marriage by coemptio or by usus, but the dissolution of the religious marriage was very difficult. For that, a new sacred ceremony was necessary, as religion alone could separate what religion had united. The effect of the conferreatio could be destroyed only by the diffareatio. The husband and wife who wished to separate appeared for the last time before the common hearth. A priest and witnesses were present. As on the day of marriage, a cake of wheaten flour was presented to the husband and wife. But, instead of sharing it between them, they rejected it. Then, instead of prayers, they pronounced formulas of a strange, severe, spiteful, frightful character, a sort of malediction, by which the wife renounced the worship and gods of the husband. From that moment the religious bond was broken. The community of worship having ceased, every other common interest ceased to exist, and the marriage was dissolved. The Ancient City, Book 2, Chapter 3, Continuity of the Family, Celibacy Forbidden, Divorce in the case of sterility, Inequality between the son and daughter. The belief relative to the dead and to the worship that was due them founded the ancient family and gave it the greater part of its rules. We have seen above that man, after death, was reputed a happy and divine being, but on the condition that the living continued to offer him the funeral repasts. If these offerings ceased, the dead ancestor fell to the rank of an unhappy and malevolent demon. For when these ancient generations began to picture a future life to themselves, they had not dreamed of rewards and punishments. They imagined that the happiness of the dead depended not upon the life led in this state of existence, but upon the way in which their descendants treated them. Every father, therefore, expected of his posterity that series of funeral repasts which was to assure his manas repose and happiness. This opinion was the fundamental principle of domestic law among the ancients. From it followed, in the first place, this rule, that every family must perpetuate itself forever. It was necessary to the dead that the descendants should not die out. In the tomb where they lived, this was the only inquietude which they experienced. Their only thought, their only interest was that there should be a man of their blood to carry them offerings at the tomb. The Hindu too believed that the dead repeated continually, "May there be born in our line sons who shall bring us rice, milk, and honey." The Hindu also had this saying, "The extinction of a family causes the ruin of the religion of this family. The ancestors, deprived of the offering of cakes, fall into the abode of the unhappy." The men of Italy and Greece long held to the same notions. If they have not left us in their writings an opinion so clearly expressed as in the old books of the East, their laws at least remain to attest their ancient opinions. At Athens, the law made it the duty of the first magistrate of the city to see that no family should become extinct. In the same way, the Roman law made provision that no family should fail and become extinct. We read in the discourse of an Athenian orator, "There is no man who, knowing that he must die, is so careless about himself as to wish to leave his family without descendants, for then there would be no one to render him that worship that is due to the dead." Every one, therefore, had an interest in leaving a son after him, convinced that his immortal happiness depended upon it. It was even a duty towards those ancestors whose happiness could last no longer than the family lasted. The laws of Manu call the oldest son the one who is begotten for the accomplishment of a duty. Here we touch upon one of the most remarkable characteristics of the ancient family. The religion that had founded it required that it should never perish. When a family becomes extinct, a worship dies out. We must take these families at a time before the belief had yet been altered. Each one of them possessed a religion and gods, a precious trust over which it was required to watch. The greatest misfortune that its piety had to fear was that its line of descendants might cease and come to an end. For then its religion would disappear from the earth, its fire would be extinguished, and the whole series of its dead would fall into oblivion and eternal misery. The great interest of human life was to continue the descent in order to continue the worship. In view of these opinions, celibacy was a grave impiety and a misfortune. An impiety because one who did not marry put the happiness of the manas of the family in peril. A misfortune because he himself would receive no worship after his death, and could not know what the manas enjoyed. Both for himself and for his ancestors, it was a sort of damnation. We can easily believe that in the absence of laws, such a belief would long be sufficient to prevent celibacy. But it appears, moreover, that as soon as there were laws, they pronounced celibacy to be wrong and a punishable offense. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who had searched the ancient annals of Rome, asserts that he had seen an old law which required young people to marry. Cicero's treatise on the laws, a treatise which almost always reproduces under a philosophic form the ancient laws of Rome, contains a law which forbids celibacy. At Sparta, the legislation of Lycurgus deprived the man who did not marry of all the rights of citizenship. We know from many anecdotes that when celibacy ceased to be forbidden by laws, usage still forbade it. Finally, it appears from a passage of Pollux that in many Greek cities the law punished celibacy as a crime. This was in accordance with the ancient belief: man did not belong to himself, he belonged to the family. He was one member in a series, and the series must not stop with him. He was not born by chance, he had been introduced into life that he might continue a worship. He must not give up life till he is sure that this worship will be continued after him. But to beget a son is not sufficient. The son who is to perpetuate the domestic religion must be the fruit of a religious marriage. The bastard, the natural son, he whom the Greeks called nothos, and the Romans spurius, could not perform the part which religion assigned to the son. In fact, the tie of blood did not of itself alone constitute the family. The tie of a common worship had to be added. Now the son born of a woman who had not been associated in the worship of the husband by the ceremony of marriage could not himself take any part in the worship. He had no right to offer the funeral repast, and the family was not perpetuated for him. We shall see farther on that for the same reason he had not the right of inheritance. Marriage, then, was obligatory. Its aim was not pleasure. Its principal object was not the union of two beings who were pleased with each other, and who wished to go united through the pleasures and the trials of life. The effect of marriage, in the eyes of religion and of the laws, was the union of two beings in the same domestic worship, in order to produce from them a third who would be qualified to continue the worship. We see this plainly by the sacramental formula that was pronounced in the act of marriage. Ducere uxorum liberum quarendorum causa was the Roman expression. Paidon ep arato nision was the Greek. This marriage having been contracted only to perpetuate the family, it seemed just that it should be broken if the wife was sterile. The right of divorce in this case always existed among the ancients. It is even possible that divorce was an obligation. In India, religion proscribed that the sterile woman should be replaced by another at the end of 8 years. That the duty was the same in Greece and Rome there is no formal text to prove. Still, Herodotus mentions 2 kings of Sparta, who were constrained to repudiate their wives on account of sterility. As to Rome, everyone knows the history of Carvilius Ruga, whose divorce is the first of which the Roman annals make mention. Carvilius Ruga, says Aulus Gellius, a man of rank, separated from his wife by divorce because he could not have children by her. He loved her tenderly and had no reason to complain of her conduct, but he sacrificed his love to the sanctity of his oath, because he had sworn, in the formula of marriage, that he took her to wife in order to have children. Religion demanded that the family should never become extinct. All affection and all natural right had to give way before this absolute rule. If the sterility of a marriage was due to the husband, it was no less necessary that the family should be continued. In that case, a brother or some other relative of the husband had to be substituted in his place. The child born of such a connection was held to be the son of the husband, and continued his worship. Such were the rules among the ancient Hindus. We find them again in the laws of Athens and in those of Sparta. So powerful was the empire of this religion, so much did religious duty surpass all others. For a still stronger reason, ancient laws prescribed the marriage of the widow, when she had had no children, with the nearest relative of her husband. The son born of such a union was reputed to be the son of the deceased. The birth of a daughter could not continue the worship, for the reason that on the day of her marriage she renounced the family and worship of her father, and belonged to the family and religion of her husband. The family, like the worship, was continued only by the males, a capital fact, the consequences of which we shall see farther on. It was therefore the son who was looked for, and who was necessary. He it was whom the family, the ancestors, and the sacred fire demanded. Through him, according to the old laws of the Hindus, a father pays the debt due to the manas of his ancestors and assures immortality to himself. This son was not less precious in the eyes of the Greeks, for later he was to perform the sacrifices, offer the funeral repast, and preserve by his worship the domestic religion. In accordance with this idea, old Aeschylus calls the son the savior of the paternal hearth. The entrance of the son into the family was signaled by a religious act. First, he had to be accepted by the father, who, as master and guardian of the hearth, and as a representative of his ancestors, had to decide whether the newcomer was or was not of the family. Birth formed only the physical bond. The declaration of the father formed the religious and moral bond. This formality was equally obligatory in Greece, in Rome, and in India. A sort of initiation was also required for the son, as we have seen it was for the daughter. This took place a short time after birth. The 9th day at Rome, the 10th in Greece, the 10th or 12th in India. On that day the father assembled the family, assembled witnesses, and offered a sacrifice to his fire. The child was presented to the domestic gods. A female carried him in her arms, and ran carrying him several times round the sacred fire. This ceremony had a double object. First, to purify the infant, that is to say, to free him from the stain which the ancients supposed he had contracted by the mere fact of gestation, and second, to initiate him into the domestic worship. From this moment the infant was admitted into this sort of sacred society or small church that was called the family. He possessed its religion, he practiced its rites, he was qualified to repeat its prayers, he honored its ancestors, and at a later period he would himself become an honored ancestor. The Ancient City, Book 2, Chapter 4, Adoption and Emancipation. The duty of perpetuating the domestic worship was the foundation of the law of adoption among the ancients. The same religion which obliged a man to marry, which pronounced a divorce in the case of sterility, which, in case of impotence or of premature death, substituted a relative in place of the husband, still offered to a family one final resource to escape the so much dreaded misfortune of extinction. This resource was the right of adoption. He to whom nature has denied a son can adopt one, so that the funeral ceremonies may not cease. Thus speaks the old legislator of the Hindus. We have a curious plea of an Athenian orator in a case where the legitimacy of a son's adoption was contested. The defendant shows us first the motive for which one adopted a son. Menecles, he says, did not wish to die without children. He was desirous of leaving behind him some one to bury him, and, in aftertime, to perform the ceremonies of the funeral worship. He then goes on to show what will happen if the tribunal annuls his adoption, what will happen not only to himself, but to the one who has adopted him. Menecles is dead, and yet it is still the interest of Menecles that is at stake. If you annul my adoption, you will leave Menecles who is dead without a son, and consequently no one will perform the sacrifices in his honor, no one will offer him the funeral repast, and thus he will be without worship. To adopt a son was then to watch over the perpetuity of the domestic religion, the safety of the sacred fire, the continuation of the funeral offerings, and the repose of the manas of the ancestors. There being no reason for adoption except the necessity of preventing the extinction of a worship, it was permitted only to one who had no son. The law of the Hindus is formal on this point. That of the Athenians is not less so. All the orations of Demosthenes against Leochares are proof of this. No particular passage proves that this was the case in the old Roman law, and we know that in the time of Gaius a man might have at the same time sons by nature and sons by adoption. It appears, however, that this point was not admitted as legal in Cicero's time, for in one of his orations the orator expresses himself thus: What is the law concerning adoption? Why, that he may adopt children who is no longer able to have children himself, and who failed of having them when he was of an age to expect it. To adopt is to seek, by regular and sacerdotal law, that which, by the ordinary process of nature, he is no longer able to obtain. Cicero attacks the adoption of Clodius, taking the ground that the man who has adopted him already has a son, and he declares that this adoption is contrary to sacerdotal law. When a son was adopted, it was necessary, first of all, that he should be initiated into a form of worship, introduced into a domestic religion, brought into the presence of a new penites. Adoption, therefore, was accompanied by a ceremony very like that which took place at the birth of a son. In this way, the newcomer was admitted to the hearth and associated in the new religion. Gods, sacred objects, rites, prayers, all became common between him and his adopted father. They said of him, in sacra transit, he has passed to the worship of the new family. By this very ceremony he renounced the worship of the old one. We have seen indeed that, according to this ancient belief, the same man could not sacrifice at two hearths, or honor two series of ancestors. Admitted to a new house, the old became foreign to him. He no longer had anything in common with the hearth near which he was born, and could no longer offer the funeral repast to his own ancestors. The ties of birth were broken. The new tie of a common worship took the ascendancy. The man became so completely a stranger to his own family that, if he happened to die, his natural father had no right to take charge of the funeral or to conduct the procession. The adopted son could not return again to the old family, or, at most, the law permitted this only when, having a son, he left that son to take his place in the adoptive family. They considered that, the perpetuity of this family being thus assured, he might leave it, but in this case he severed all the ties that bound him to his own son. Emancipation corresponded as a correlative to adoption. In order that a son might enter a new family, it was necessary that he should be able to leave the old, that is to say, that he should be emancipated from its religion. The principal effect of emancipation was the renunciation of the worship of the family in which one was born. The Romans designated this act by the very significant name of sacrorum detestatio. Book 2, Chapter 5. Kinship, what the Romans called agnation. Plato says that kinship is the community of the same domestic gods. When Demosthenes wishes to prove that two men are relatives, he shows that they practice the same religious rites and offer the funeral repast at the same tomb. Indeed, it was the domestic religion that constituted relationship. Two men could call themselves relatives when they had the same gods, the same sacred fire, and the same funeral repast. Now, we have already observed that the right to offer sacrifices to the sacred fire was transmitted only from male to male, and that the worship of the dead was addressed to the ascendants in the male line only. It followed from this rule that one could not be related through females. In the opinion of those ancient generations, a female transmitted neither being nor worship. The son owed all to the father. Besides, one could not belong to two families or invoke two fires. The son, therefore, had no other religion or other family than that of the father. How could there have been a maternal family? His mother herself, on the day on which the sacred rites of marriage were performed, had absolutely renounced her own family. From that time she had offered the funeral repast to her husband's ancestors, as if she had become their daughter. And she had no longer offered it to her own ancestors, because she was no longer considered as descended from them. She had preserved neither religious nor legal connection with the family in which she was born. For a still stronger reason, her son had nothing in common with this family. The foundation of relationship was not birth, it was worship. This is seen clearly in India. There, the chief of the family, twice each month, offers the funeral repast. he presents a cake to the manes of his father, another to his paternal grandfather, and a third to his great-grandfather, never to those from whom he is descended on the mother's side, neither to his mother nor to his mother's father. Afterwards, ascending still higher, but always in the same line, he makes an offering to fourth, fifth, and sixth ascendant. The offering to these last is lighter. It is a libation of water and a few grains of rice. Such is the funeral repast, and it is according to the accomplishment of these rites that relationship is reckoned. When two men who offer their funeral repasts separately can, each one by ascending through a series of 6 ancestors, find one who is common to both, they are akin. They are called samanodikas, if the common ancestor is one of those to whom they offer only the libation of water, sapindas if he is of those to whom the cake is presented. Counting according to our usage, the relation of the sapindas would go to the 7th degree, and that of the samanodikas to the 14th. In both cases, the relationship is shown by the fact that both make an offering to the same ancestor. And we see that in this system, the relationship through females cannot be admitted. The case was the same in the West. There has been much discussion as to what the Roman jurists understood by agnation. But the problem is of easy solution as soon as we bring agnation and the domestic religion together. Just as this religion was transmitted only from male to male, so it is attested by all the ancient jurists that two men can be agnates only when, ascending from male to male, they were found to have common ancestors. The rule for agnation was, then, the same as that for worship. There was between these two things a manifest relation. Agnation was nothing more than relationship such as religion had originally established it. To render this truth clearer, let us trace the genealogical table of a Roman family. In this table, the 5th generation, which lived towards the year 140 BC, is represented by 4 personages. Were they all akin? According to our modern ideas on this subject, they were. In the opinion of the Romans, all were not. Now let us inquire if they all had the same domestic worship, that is to say, if they all made offerings to the same ancestors. Let us suppose the 3rd Scipio Asiaticus, who alone remains of his branch, offering the funeral repast on a particular day. Ascending from male to male, he finds, for the 3rd ancestor, Publius Scipio. Again, Scipio Aemilianus, offering his sacrifice, will meet in the series of his ascendants this same Publius Scipio. Scipio Asiaticus and Scipio Aemilianus are therefore related to each other. Among the Hindus, they would be called sapindas. On the other hand, Scipio Serapio has for a 4th ancestor L. Cornelius Scipio, who is also the 4th ancestor of Scipio Aemilianus. They are therefore akin. Among the Hindus, they would be called samanodikas. In the judicial and religious language of the Romans, these 3 Scipios are agnates. The 2 first are agnates in the 6th degree, the 3rd is their agnate in the 8th degree. The case is not the same with Tiberius Gracchus. This man, who, according to our modern customs, would be nearest related to Scipio Aemilianus, was not related to him in the remotest degree. It was of small account, indeed, for Tiberius that he was the son of Cornelia, the daughter of the Scipios. Neither he nor Cornelia herself belonged to that family in a religious point of view. He had no other ancestors than the Semproni. It is to them that he offers the funeral repast. In ascending the series of his ancestors, he never comes to a Scipio. Scipio Aemilianus and Tiberius Gracchus, therefore, are not agnates. The tie of blood does not suffice to establish this relationship. A common worship is necessary. We can now understand why, in the eyes of the Roman law, 2 consanguineous brothers were agnates, while 2 uterine brothers were not. Still, we cannot say the descent by males was the immutable principle on which relationship was founded. It was not by birth, it was by worship alone that the agnates were recognized. The son whom emancipation had detached from the worship was no longer the agnate of his father. The stranger who had been adopted, that is to say, who had been admitted to the worship, became the agnate of the one adopting him, and even of the whole family. So true is it that it was religion that established relationship. There came a time indeed for India and Greece, as well as for Rome, when relationship of worship was no longer the only kind admitted. By degrees, as this old religion lost its hold, the voice of blood spoke louder, and the relationship of birth was recognized in law. The Romans gave the name of cognatio to this sort of relationship, which was absolutely independent of the rules of the domestic religion. When we read the jurists from Cicero to Justinian, we see the two systems as rivals of each other, and contending in the domain of law. But in the time of the 12 Tables, agnation was the only relationship known, and this alone conferred the right of inheritance. We shall see farther on that the case was the same among the Greeks. Book 2, Chapter 6, The Right of Property. Here is an institution of the ancients of which we must not form an idea from anything that we see around us. The ancients founded the right of property on principles different from those of the present generation. As a result, the laws by which they guaranteed it are sensibly different from ours. We know that there are races who have never succeeded in establishing among themselves the right of private property, while others have reached this stage only after long and painful experience. It is not indeed an easy problem in the origin of society to decide whether the individual may appropriate the soil and establish such a bond between his being and a portion of the earth that he can say, "This land is mine, this is the same as a part of me." The Tartars have an idea of the right of property in the case of flocks or herds, but they cannot understand it when it is a question of land. Among the ancient Germans, the earth belonged to no one. Every year the tribe assigned to each one of its members a lot to cultivate, and the lot was changed the following year. The German was proprietor of the harvest, but not of the land. The case is still the same among a part of the Semitic race, and among some of the Slavic nations. On the other hand, the nations of Greece and Italy, from the earliest antiquity, always held to the idea of private property. We do not find an age when the soil was common among them, nor do we find anything that resembles the annual allotment of land which was in vogue among the Germans. And here we note a remarkable fact. While the races that do not accord to the individual a property in the soil allow him at least a right to the fruits of his labor, that is to say, to his harvest, precisely the contrary custom prevailed among the Greeks. In many cities, the citizens were required to store their crops in common, or at least the greater part, and to consume them in common. The individual, therefore, was not the master of the corn which he had gathered, but at the same time, by a singular contradiction, he had an absolute property in the soil. To him the land was more than the harvest. It appears that among the Greeks the conception of private property was developed exactly contrary to what appears to be the natural order. It was not applied to the harvest first and to the soil afterwards, but followed the inverse order. There are three things which, from the most ancient times, we find founded and solidly established in these Greek and Italian societies: the domestic religion, the family, and the right of property. Three things which had in the beginning a manifest relation, and which appear to have been inseparable. The idea of private property existed in the religion itself. Every family had its hearth and its ancestors. These gods could be adored only by this family, and protected it alone. They were its property. Now, between these gods and the soil, men of the early ages saw a mysterious relation. Let us first take the hearth. This altar is the symbol of a sedentary life. Its name indicates this. It must be placed upon the ground. Once established, it cannot be moved. The god of the family wishes to have a fixed abode. Materially, it is difficult to transport the stone on which he shines. Religiously, this is more difficult still, and is permitted to a man only when hard necessity presses him, when an enemy is pursuing him, or when the soil cannot support him. When they establish the hearth, it is with the thought and hope that it will always remain in the same spot. The god is installed there not for a day, not for the life of one man merely, but for as long a time as this family shall endure, and there remains anyone to support its fire by sacrifices. Thus the sacred fire takes possession of the soil and makes it its own. It is the god's property. And the family, which through duty and religion remains grouped around its altar, is as much fixed to the soil as the altar itself. The idea of domicile follows naturally. The family is attached to the altar is attached to the soil. An intimate relation, therefore, is established between the soil and the family. There must be his permanent home, which he will not dream of quitting unless an unforeseen necessity constrains him to it. Like the hearth, it will always occupy this spot. This spot belongs to it, is its property, the property not simply of a man, but of a family, whose different members must, one after another, be born and die here. Let us follow the idea of the ancients. Two sacred fires represent two distinct divinities, who are never united or confounded. This is so true that even intermarriage between two families does not establish an alliance between their gods. The sacred fire must be isolated, that is to say, completely separated from all that is not of itself. The stranger must not approach it at the moment when the ceremonies of the worship are performed, or even be in sight of it. It is for this reason that these gods are called the concealed gods, Mishi, or the interior gods, Penates. In order that this religious rule may be well observed, there must be an enclosure around this hearth at a certain distance. It did not matter whether this enclosure was a hedge, a wall of wood, or one of stone. Whatever it was, it marked the limit which separated the domain of one sacred fire from that of another. This enclosure was deemed sacred. It was an impious act to pass it. The god watched over it and kept it under his care. They therefore applied to this god the epithet of Irhios. This enclosure, traced and protected by religion, was the most certain emblem, the most undoubted mark of the right of property. Let us return to the primitive ages of the Aryan race. The sacred enclosure, which the Greeks call Iahos, and the Latins Herctum, was the somewhat spacious enclosure in which the family had its house, its flocks, and the small field that it cultivated. In the midst rose the protecting fire god. Let us descend to the succeeding ages. The tribes have reached Greece and Italy, and have built cities. The dwellings are brought nearer together. They are not, however, contiguous. The sacred enclosure still exists, but is of smaller proportions. Oftenest it is reduced to a low wall, a ditch, a furrow, or to a mere open space a few feet wide. But in no case could two houses be joined to each other. A party wall was supposed to be an impossible thing. The same wall could not be common to two houses, for then the sacred enclosure of the gods would have disappeared. At Rome, the law fixed 2.5 feet as the width of the free space, which was always to separate two houses, and this space was consecrated to the god of the enclosure. A result of these old religious rules was that a community of property was never established among the ancients. A phalanstery was never known among them. Even Pythagoras did not succeed in establishing institutions which the most intimate religion of men resisted. Neither do we find at any epoch in the life of the ancients anything that resembled that multitude of villages so general in France during the 12th century. Every family having its gods and its worship was required to have its particular place on the soil, its isolated domicile, its property. According to the Greeks, the sacred fire taught men to build houses, and indeed men who were fixed by their religion to one spot, which they believed it their duty not to quit, would soon begin to think of raising in that place some solid structure. The tent covers the Arab, the wagon the Tartar, but a family that has a domestic hearth has need of a permanent dwelling. The stone house soon succeeds the mud cabin or the wooden hut. The family did not build for the life of a single man, but for generations that were to succeed each other in the same dwelling. The house was always placed in the sacred enclosure. Among the Greeks, the square which composed the enclosure was divided into two parts. The first part was the court, the house occupied the second. The hearth, placed near the middle of the whole enclosure, was thus at the bottom of the court, and near the entrance of the house. At Rome the disposition was different, but the principle was the same. The hearth remained in the middle of the enclosure, but the buildings rose round it on four sides, so as to enclose it with a little court. We can easily understand the idea that inspired this system of construction. The walls are raised around the hearth to isolate and defend it, and we may say, as the Greeks said, that religion taught men to build houses. In this house the family is master and proprietor. Its domestic divinity assures it this right. The house is consecrated by the perpetual presence of gods. It is a temple which preserves them. What is there more holy, says Cicero? What is there more carefully fenced round with every description of religious respect than the house of each individual citizen? Here is his altar, here is his hearth, here are his household gods. Here all his sacred rites, all his religious ceremonies are preserved. To enter this house with any malevolent intention was a sacrilege. The domicile was inviolable. According to a Roman tradition, the domestic god repulsed the robber and kept off the enemy. Let us pass to another object of worship, the tomb, and we shall see that the same ideas were attached to this. The tomb held a very important place in the religion of the ancients, for, on one hand, worship was due to the ancestors, and on the other, the principal ceremony of this worship, the funeral repast, was to be performed on the very spot where the ancestors rested. The family therefore had a common tomb, where its members, one after another, must come to sleep. For this tomb the rule was the same as for the hearth. It was no more permitted to unite two families in the same tomb than it was to establish two domestic hearths in the same house. To bury one out of the family tomb, or to place a stranger in this tomb, was equally impious. The domestic religion, both in life and in death, separated every family from all others, and strictly rejected all appearances of community. Just as the houses could not be contiguous, so the tombs could not touch each other. Each one of them, like the house, had a sort of isolating enclosure. How manifest is the character of private property in all this? The dead are gods, who belong to a particular family, which alone has the right to invoke them. These gods have taken possession of the soil. They live under this little mound, and no one, except one of the family, can think of meddling with them. Furthermore, no one has the right to dispossess them of the soil which they occupy. A tomb among the ancients could never be destroyed or displaced. This was forbidden by the severest laws. Here, therefore, was a portion of the soil which, in the name of religion, became an object of perpetual property for each family. The family appropriated to itself this soil by placing its dead here. It was established here for all time. The living scion of this family could rightly say, "This land is mine." It was so completely his that it was inseparable from him, and he had not the right to dispose of it. The soil where the dead rested was inalienable and imprescriptible. The Roman law required that, if a family sold the field where the tomb was situated, it should still retain the ownership of this tomb, and should always preserve the right to cross the field in order to perform the ceremonies of its worship. The ancient usage was to inter the dead not in cemeteries or by the roadside, but in the field belonging to the family. This custom of ancient times is attested by a law of Solon, and by several passages in Plutarch. We learn from an oration of Demosthenes that even in his time, each family buried its dead in its own field, and that when a domain was bought in Attica, the burial place of the old proprietors was found there. As for Italy, This same custom is proved to have existed by the laws of the 12 Tables, by passages from 2 jurisconsults, and by this sentence of Siccius Flaccus. Anciently, there were 2 ways of placing the tomb. Some placed it on one side of the field, others towards the middle. From this custom we can see that the idea of property was easily extended from the small mound to the field that surrounded this mound. In the works of the elder Cato, there is a formula according to which the Italian laborer prayed the manis to watch over his field, to take good care against the thief, and to bless him with a good harvest. Thus these souls of the dead extended tutelary action, and with it their right of property, even to the boundaries of the domain. Through them the family was sole master in this field. The tomb had established an indissoluble union of the family with the land, that of ownership. In the greater number of primitive societies, the right of property was established by religion. In the Bible, the Lord said to Abraham, "I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it." And to Moses, "Go up hence into the land which I swear unto Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, Unto thee will I give it." Thus God, the primitive proprietor, by right of creation, delegates to man his ownership over a part of the soil. There was something analogous among the ancient Greco-Italian peoples. It was not the religion of Jupiter that founded this right, it is true, perhaps because this religion did not yet exist. The gods who conferred upon every family its right to a portion of the soil were the domestic gods, the sacred fire, and the manas. The first religion that exercised its empire on their minds was also the one that established the right of property among them. It is clearly evident that private property was an institution that the domestic religion had need of. This religion required that both dwellings and burying places should be separable from each other. Living in common was therefore impossible. The same religion required that the hearth should be fixed to the soil, that the tomb should neither be destroyed nor displaced. Suppress the right of property, and the sacred fire would be without a fixed place. The families would become confounded, and the dead would be abandoned and without worship. By the stationary hearth and the permanent burial place, the family took possession of the soil. The earth was in some sort imbued and penetrated by the religion of the hearth and of the ancestors. Thus the men of the early ages were saved the trouble of resolving too difficult a problem. Without discussion, without labor, without a shadow of hesitation, they arrived, at a single step, and merely by virtue of their belief, at a conception of the right of property, this right from which all civilization springs, since by it man improves the soil and becomes improved himself. Religion, and not laws, first guaranteed the right of property. Every domain was under the eyes of household divinities, who watched over it. Every field had to be surrounded, as we have seen, for the house, by an enclosure, which separated it completely from the domains of other families. This enclosure was not a wall of stone, it was a band of soil a few feet wide, which remained uncultivated, and which the plough could never touch. This space was sacred. The Roman law declared it indefeasible. It belonged to the religion. On certain appointed days of each month and year, the father of the family went round his field, following this line. He drove victims before him, sang hymns, and offered sacrifices. By this ceremony he believed he had awakened the benevolence of his gods towards his field and his house. Above all, he had marked his right of property by proceeding round his field with his domestic worship. The path which the victims and prayers had followed was the inviolable limit of the domain. On this line, at certain points, the men placed large stones or trunks of trees, which they called termini. We can form a good idea as to what these bounds were, and what ideas were connected with them, by the manner in which the piety of men established them. This, says Siccius Flaccus, was the manner in which our ancestors proceeded. They commenced by digging a small hole and placing the terminus upright near it. Next, they crowned the terminus with garlands of grasses and flowers. Then they offered a sacrifice. The victim being immolated, they made the blood flow into the hole. They threw in live coals, kindled probably at the sacred fire of the hearth, grain, cakes, fruits, a little wine, and some honey. When all this was consumed in the hole, they thrust down the stone or piece of wood upon the ashes while they were still warm. It is easy to see that the object of the ceremony was to make of this terminus a sort of sacred representation of the domestic worship. To continue this character for it, they renewed the sacred act every year by pouring out libations and reciting prayers. The terminus, once placed in the earth, became in some sort the domestic religion implanted in the soil, to indicate that this soil was forever the property of the family. Later, poetry lending its aid, the terminus was considered a distinct god. The employment of termini, or sacred bounds for fields, appears to have been universal among the Indo-European race. It existed among the Hindus at a very early date, and the sacred ceremonies of the boundaries had among them a great analogy with those which Siculus Flaccus has described for Italy. Before the foundation of Rome, we find the terminus among the Sabines. We also find it among the Etruscans. The Hellenes, too, had sacred landmarks, which they called Ori Thei Orii. The terminus once established according to the required rites, there was no power on earth that could displace it. It was to remain in the same place through all ages. This religious principle was expressed at Rome by a legend. Jupiter, having wished to prepare himself a site on the Capitoline Hill for a temple, could not displace the god Terminus. This old tradition shows how sacred property had become, for the immovable terminus signified nothing less than inviolable property. In fact, the terminus guarded the limit of the field and watched over it. A neighbor dared not approach too near it. For then, says Ovid, the god who felt himself struck by the plowshare or mattock cried, "Stop, this is my field, there is yours." To encroach upon the field of a family, it was necessary to overturn or displace a boundary mark, and this boundary mark was a god. The sacrilege was horrible, and the chastisement severe. According to the old Roman law, the man and the oxen who touched a terminus were devoted. That is to say, both man and oxen were immolated in expiation. The Etruscan law, speaking in the name of religion, says, "He who shall have touched or displaced a bound shall be condemned by the gods. His house shall disappear, his race shall be extinguished, his land shall no longer produce fruits. Hail, rust, and the fires of the dog-star shall destroy his harvests. The limbs of the guilty one shall be covered with ulcers and shall waste away." We do not possess the text of the Athenian law on this subject. There remains of it only 3 words which signify "do not pass the boundaries." But Plato appears to complete the thought of the legislator when he says, "Our first law ought to be this: let no person touch the bounds which separate his field from that of his neighbor, for this ought to remain immovable. Let no one attempt to disturb the small stone which separates friendship from enmity, and which the landowners have bound themselves by an oath to leave in its place." From all these beliefs, from all these usages, from all these laws, it clearly follows that the domestic religion taught man to appropriate the soil, and assured him his right to it. There is no difficulty in understanding that the right of property, having been thus conceived and established, was much more complete and absolute in its effects than it can be in our modern societies, where it is founded upon other principles. Property was so inherent in the domestic religion that a family could not renounce one without renouncing the other. The house and the field were, so to speak, incorporated in it, and it could neither lose them nor dispose of them. Plato, in his treatise on the laws, did not pretend to advance a new idea when he forbade the proprietor to sell his field. He did no more than to recall an old law. Everything leads us to believe that in the ancient ages property was inalienable. It is well known that at Sparta the citizen was formally forbidden to sell his lot of land, There was the same interdiction in the laws of Locri and of Leucadia. Phaedon of Corinth, a legislator of the 9th century BC, prescribed that the number of families and of estates should remain unchangeable. Now this prescription could be observed only when it was forbidden to sell an estate, or even to divide it. The law of Solon, later by 7 or 8 generations than that of Phaedon of Corinth, no longer forbade a man to sell his land, but punished the vendor by a severe fine and the loss of the rights of citizenship. Finally, Aristotle mentions, in a general manner, that in many cities the ancient laws forbade the sale of land. Such laws ought not to surprise us. Found property on the right of labor, and a man may dispose of it. Found it on religion, and he can no longer do this. A tie stronger than the will of man binds the land to him. Besides, this field where the tomb is situated, where the divine ancestors live, where the family is forever to perform its worship, is not simply the property of a man, but of a family. It is not the individual actually living who has established his right over this soil. It is the domestic god. The individual has it in trust only. It belongs to those who are dead, and to those who are not yet to be born. It is a part of the body of this family, and cannot be separated from it. To detach one from the other is to alter a worship, to offend a religion. Among the Hindus, property, also founded upon religion, was also inalienable. We know nothing of Roman law previous to the laws of the 12 Tables. It is certain that at that time the sale of property was permitted, but there are reasons for thinking that in the earlier days of Rome, and in Italy before the existence of Rome, land was inalienable, as in Greece. Though there remains no evidence of this old law, there remains to us at least the modifications which were made in it by degrees. The law of the 12 Tables, though attaching to the tomb the character of inalienability, has freed the soil from it. Afterwards it was permitted to divide property, if there were several brothers, but on condition that a new religious ceremony should be performed, and that the new partition should be made by a priest. Religion only could divide what had before been proclaimed indivisible. Finally, it was permitted to sell the domain, but for that formalities of a religious character were also necessary. This sale could take place only in the presence of a priest, whom they called libripens, and with the sacred formality which they called mancipation. Something analogous is seen in Greece. The sale of a house or of land was always accompanied with a sacrifice to the gods. Every transfer of property needed to be authorized by religion. If a man could not, or could only with difficulty dispose of land, for a still stronger reason he could not be deprived of it against his will. The appropriation of land for public utility was unknown among the ancients. Confiscation was resorted to only in case of condemnation to exile. That is to say, when a man, deprived of his right to citizenship, could no longer exercise any right over the soil of the city. Nor was the taking of property for debt known in the ancient laws of cities. The laws of the 12 Tables assuredly do not spare the debtor. Still, they do not permit his property to be sold for the benefit of the creditor. The body of the debtor is held for the debt, not his land, for the land is inseparable from the family. It is easier to subject a man to servitude than to take his property from him. The debtor is placed in the hands of the creditor. His land follows him in some sort into slavery. The master who uses the physical strength of a man for his own profit enjoys at the same time the fruits of his land, but does not become the proprietor of it. So inviolable above all else is the right of property. Book 2, Chapter 7, The Right of Succession. 1. Nature and principle of the right of succession among the ancients. The right of property having been established for the accomplishment of an hereditary worship, it was not possible that this right should fail after the short life of an individual. The man dies, the worship remains. The fire must not be extinguished, nor the tomb abandoned. So long as the domestic religion continued, the right of property had to continue with it. Two things are closely allied in the creeds as well as in the laws of the ancients: the family worship and its property. It was therefore a rule without exception in both Greek and Roman law that a property could not be acquired without the worship, or the worship without the property. Religion prescribes, says Cicero, that the property and the worship of a family shall be inseparable, and that the care of the sacrifices shall always devolve upon the one who receives the inheritance. At Athens, an orator claims a succession in these terms: "Weigh it well, O judges, and say whether my adversary or I ought to inherit the estate of Philoctemon, and offer the sacrifices upon his tomb." Could one say more directly that the care of the worship was inseparable from the succession? It was the same in India. He who inherits, whoever he may be, is bound to make the offerings upon the tomb. From this principle were derived all the rules regarding the right of succession among the ancients. The first is that, the domestic religion being, as we have seen, hereditary from male to male, property is the same. As the son is the natural continuator of the religion, he also inherits the estate. Thus the rule of inheritance is found. It is not the result of a simple agreement made between men. It is derived from their belief, from their religion, from that which has the greatest power over their minds. It is not the personal will of the father that causes the son to inherit. The father need not make a will. The son inherits of full right. Ipso iure eres existit, says the jurisconsult. He is even a necessary successor, eres necessarius. He has neither to accept nor to reject the inheritance. The continuation of the property, like that of the worship, is for him an obligation, as well as a right. Whether he wishes it or not, the inheritance falls to him, whatever it may be, even with its encumbrances and its debts. The right to inherit without the debts, and to reject an inheritance, was not allowed to the son in Greek legislation, and was not introduced until a later period into Roman law. The judicial language of Rome calls the son eris suis, as if one should say eris sui ipsius. In fact, he inherits only of himself. Between his father and him there is neither donation, nor legacy, nor change of property. There is simply a continuation, morte parentis continuatur dominium. Already during the life of the father, the son was co-proprietor of the field and house, vivo quoque patri dominus existimatur. To form an idea of inheritance among the ancients, we must not figure to ourselves a fortune which passes from the hands of one to those of another. The fortune is immovable, like the hearth, and the tomb to which it is attached. It is the man who passes away. It is the man who, as the family unrolls its generations, arrives at his hour appointed to continue the worship, and to take care of the domain. 2. The son, not the daughter, inherits. It is here that ancient laws at first sight appear whimsical and unjust. We experience some surprise when we see in the Roman law that the daughter does not inherit if she is married, and that, according to the Greek law, she does not inherit in any case. What concerns the collateral branches appears, at first sight, still farther removed from nature and justice. This is because all these laws flow, according to a very rigorous logic, from the creed and religion that we have described above. The rule for the worship is that it shall be transmitted from male to male. The rule for the inheritance is that it shall follow the worship. The daughter is not qualified to continue the paternal religion, since she may marry, and thus renounce the religion of her father to adopt that of her husband. She has therefore no right to the inheritance. If a father should happen to leave his property to a daughter, this property would be separated from the worship, which would be inadmissible. The daughter could not even fulfill the first duty of an heir, which was to continue the series of funeral repasts, since she would offer the sacrifices to the ancestors of her husband. Religion forbade her, therefore, to inherit from her father. Such is the ancient principle. It influenced equally the legislators of the Hindus and those of Greece and Rome. The three peoples had the same laws, not because they had borrowed from each other, but because they had derived their laws from the same belief. After the death of the father, says the Code of Manu, let the brothers divide the patrimony among them. And the legislator adds that he recommends the brothers to endow their sisters, which proves that the latter have not of themselves any right to the paternal succession. This was the case too at Athens. Demosthenes, in his orations, often has occasion to show that daughters cannot inherit. He is himself an example of the application of this rule, for he had a sister, and we know from his own writings that he was the sole heir to the estate. His father had reserved only the 7th part to endow the daughter. As to Rome, the provisions of primitive law which excluded the daughters from the inheritance are not known to us from any formal and precise text, but they have left profound traces in the laws of later ages. The Institutes of Justinian still excluded the daughter from the number of natural heirs, if she was no longer under the power of the father, and she was no longer under the power of the father after she had been married according to the religious rites. From this it follows that, if the daughter before marriage could share in the inheritance with her brother, she had not this right after marriage had attached her to another religion and another family. And if this was still the case in the time of Justinian, we may suppose that in primitive law this principle was applied in all its rigor, and that the daughter not yet married, but who would one day marry, had no right to inherit the estate. The Institutes also mention the old principle, then obsolete but not forgotten, which prescribed that an inheritance always descended to the males. It was clearly as a vestige of this old rule that, according to the civil law, a woman could never be constituted an heiress. The farther we ascend from the Institutes of Justinian towards earlier times, the nearer we approach this rule that woman could not inherit. In Cicero's time, if a father left a son and a daughter, he could will to the daughter only 1/3 of his fortune. If there was only a daughter, she could still have but half. We must also note that, to enable this daughter to receive 1/3 or half of this patrimony, it was necessary that the father should make a will in her favor. The daughter had nothing of full right. Finally, a century and a half before Cicero, Cato, wishing to revive ancient manners, proposed and carried the Voconian law, which forbade 1. Making a woman an heiress, even if she was an only child, married or unmarried. 2. The willing to a woman of more than 1/4 part of the patrimony. The Voconian law merely renewed laws of an earlier date, for we cannot suppose it would have been accepted by the contemporaries of the Scipios if it had not been supported upon old principles which they still respected. It re-established what time had changed. Let us add that it contained nothing regarding heirship ad intestat, probably because on this point the old law was still in force, and there was nothing to repair on the subject. At Rome, as in Greece, the primitive law excluded the daughter from the heritage, and this was only a natural and inevitable consequence of the principles which religion had established. It is true men soon found out a way of reconciling the religious prescription which forbade the daughter to inherit with the natural sentiment which would have her enjoy the fortune of her father. The law decided that the daughter should marry the heir. Athenian legislation carried this principle to its ultimate consequences. If the deceased left a son and a daughter, the son alone inherited and endowed his sister. If they were not both children of the same mother, he had his choice to marry her or to endow her. If the deceased left only a daughter, his nearest of kin was his heir, but this relative, who was of course also a near relative of the daughter, was required nevertheless to marry her. More than this, if this daughter was already married, she was required to abandon her husband in order to marry her father's heir. The heir himself might be already married. In this case, he obtained a divorce in order to marry his relative. We see here how completely ancient law ignored nature to conform to religion. The necessity of satisfying the requirements of religion, combined with the desire of saving the interests of an only daughter, gave rise to another subterfuge. On this point, Hindu law and Athenian law correspond marvelously. We read in the laws of Manu, "He who has no male child may require his daughter to give him a son, who shall become his, and who may perform the funeral ceremonies in his honor." In this case, the father was required to admonish the husband to whom he gave his daughter by pronouncing this formula: "I give you this daughter, adorned with jewels, who has no brother. The son born of her shall be my son, and shall celebrate my obsequies." The custom was the same at Athens. The father could continue his descent through his daughter by giving her a husband on this special condition. The son who was born of such a union was reputed the son of the wife's father, followed his worship, assisted at his religious ceremonies, and later guarded his tomb. In Hindu law, this child inherited from his grandfather as if he had been his son. It was exactly the same at Athens. When the father had married his daughter in the manner we have described, his heir was neither his daughter nor his son-in-law, it was the daughter's son. As soon as the latter had attained his majority, he took possession of the patrimony of his maternal grandfather, though his father and mother were still living. This singular tolerance of religion and law confirms the rule which we have already pointed out. The daughter was not qualified to inherit. But, by a very natural softening of the rigor of this principle, the only daughter was considered as an intermediary by whom the family might be continued. She did not inherit, but the worship and the inheritance were transmitted through her. 3. Of the collateral succession. A man died without children. To know who the heir of his estate was, we have only to learn who was qualified to continue his worship. Now, the domestic religion was transmitted by blood from male to male. The descent in the male line alone established between two men the religious relation which permitted one to continue the worship of the other. What is called relationship, as we have seen above, was nothing more than the expression of this relation. One was a relative because he had the same worship, the same original sacred fire, the same ancestors. But one was not a relative because he had the same mother. Religion did not admit of kinship through women. The children of two sisters, or of a sister and a brother, had no bond of kinship between them, and belonged neither to the same domestic religion nor to the same family. These principles regulated the order of succession. If a man, having lost his son and his daughter, left only grandchildren after him, his son's son inherited, but not his daughter's son. In default of descendants, he had as an heir his brother, not his sister, the son of his brother, not the son of his sister. In default of brothers and nephews, it was necessary to go up in the series of ascendants of the deceased, always in the male line, until a branch of the family was found that was detached through a male, then to redescend in this branch from male to male until a living man was found. This was the heir. These rules were in force equally among the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Romans. In India, the inheritance belongs to the nearest sapinda, in default of a sapinda, to the samanodaka. Now, we have seen that the relationship which these two words expressed was the religious relationship, or the relationship through the males, and corresponded to the Roman agnation. Here again is the law of Athens. If a man dies without children, the heir is the brother of the deceased, provided he is a consanguineous brother. In default of him, the son of the brother, for the succession always passes to the males, and to the descendants of males. They still cited this old law in the time of Demosthenes, although it had already been modified, and they had commenced at this epoch to admit relationship through women. In the same way, the 12 Tables ordained that, if a man died without his heir, the succession belonged to the nearest agnate. Now, we have seen that one was never an agnate through females. The ancient Roman law also specified that the nephew inherited from the patruus, that is to say, from his father's brother, and did not inherit from the avunculus, his mother's brother. By returning to the table which we have traced of the family of the Scipios, it will be seen that, Scipio Aemilianus having died without children, his estate could not pass either to Cornelia, his aunt, nor to C. Gracchus, who, according to our modern ideas, was his cousin german, but to Scipio Asiaticus, who was really his nearest of kin. In the time of Justinian, the legislator no longer understood these old laws. They appeared unjust to him, and he complained of the excessive rigor of the laws of the 12 Tables, which always accorded the preference to the masculine posterity, and excluded from the inheritance those who were related to the deceased only through females. Unjust laws, if you will, for they made no account of natural affection, but singularly logical laws, for setting out from the principle that the inheritance was attached to the worship, they excluded from the inheritance those whom this religion did not authorize to continue the worship. 4. Effects of emancipation and adoption. We have already seen that emancipation and adoption produced a change in a man's worship. The first separated him from the paternal worship, the second initiated him into the religion of another family. Here also the ancient law conformed to the rules of religion. The son who had been excluded from the parental worship by emancipation was also excluded from the inheritance. On the other hand, the stranger who had been associated in the worship of a family by adoption became a son there. He continued its worship and inherited the estate. In both cases, ancient law made more account of the religious tie than of the tie of birth. As it was contrary to religion that one man should have 2 domestic worships, so he could not inherit from 2 families. Besides, the adopted son who inherited of the adopting family did not inherit from his natural family. Athenian law was very explicit on this point. The orations of Attic orators often show us men who have been adopted into a family and who wished to inherit in the one in which they were born, but the law was against them. The adopted son could not inherit from his own family unless he re-entered it. He could not re-enter it except by renouncing the adopting family. He could leave this latter only on 2 conditions. The one was that the domestic worship for the continuation of which he had been adopted did not cease by his abandonment, and, to make this certain, it was necessary for him to leave this family a son who should replace him. This son took charge of the worship and inherited the estate. The father could then return to the family of his birth and inherit its property. But this father and son could no longer inherit from each other. They were not of the same family. They were not of kin. We can easily see what was the idea of the old legislator when he established these precise rules. He did not suppose it possible that 2 estates could fall to the same heir, because 2 domestic worships could not be kept up by the same person. 5. Wills were not known originally. The right of willing, that is to say, of disposing of one's property after death in order to make it pass to other than natural heirs, was in opposition to the religious creed that was at the foundation of the law of property and the law of succession. The property being inherent in the worship, and the worship being hereditary, could one think of a will? Besides, property did not belong to the individual, but to the family, for man had not acquired it by right of labor, but through the domestic worship. Attached to the family, it was transmitted from the dead to the living, not according to the will and choice of the dead, but by virtue of superior rules which religion had established. The will was not known in ancient Hindu law. Athenian legislation, up to Solon's time, forbade it absolutely, and Solon himself permitted it only to those who left no children. Wills were for a long time forbidden or unknown at Sparta, and were authorized only after the Peloponnesian War. Aristotle speaks of a time when the case was the same at Corinth and at Thebes. It is certain that the power of transmitting one's property arbitrarily by will was not recognized as a natural right. The constant principle of the ancient ages was that all property should remain in the family to which religion had attached it. Plato, in his treatise on the laws, which is largely a commentary on the Athenian laws, explains very clearly the thought of ancient legislators. He supposes that a man on his deathbed demands the power to make a will, and that he cries, "O gods, is it not very hard that I am not able to dispose of my property as I may choose, and in favor of any one to whom I please to give it, leaving more to this one, less to that one, according to the attachment which they have shown for me?" But the legislator replies to this man, "Thou who canst not promise thyself a single day, thou who art only a pilgrim here below, does it belong to thee to decide such affairs? Thou art the master neither of thy property nor of thyself. Thou and thy estate, all these things belong to thy family, that is to say, to thy ancestors and to thy posterity." For us, the ancient laws of Rome are very obscure. They were obscure even to Cicero. What we know reaches little farther back than the 12 Tables, which certainly are not the primitive legislation of Rome, and of these only fragments remain. This code authorizes the will, yet the fragment relating to the subject is too short, and too evidently incomplete to enable us to flatter ourselves that we know the exact provisions of the legislators in this matter. When they granted the power of devising property, we do not know what reserve and what conditions they placed upon it. We have no legal text earlier than the 12 Tables that either forbids or permits a will. But the language preserved traces of a time when wills were not known, for it called the son the self-successor and necessary, eris suus et necessarius. This formula, which Gaius and Justinian still employed, but which was no longer in accord with the legislation of their time, came, without doubt, from a distant epoch when the son could not be disinherited or refuse the heritage. The father had not then the free disposition of his fortune. In default of sons, and if the deceased had only collateral relatives, the will was not absolutely unknown, but was not easily made valid. Important formalities were necessary. First, secrecy was not allowed to the testator during life. The man who disinherited his family and violated the law that religion had established had to do this publicly, in broad daylight, and take upon himself during his lifetime all the odium attached to such an act. This was not all. It was also necessary that the will of the testator should receive the approbation of the sovereign authority, that is to say, of the people assembled by curies under the presidency of the pontiff. We must not imagine that this was an empty formality, particularly in the early ages. These comitia by curies were the most solemn assemblies of the Roman city, and it would be puerile to say that they convoked the people under the presidency of the religious chief to act simply as witnesses at the reading of a will. We may suppose that the people voted, and we shall see, on reflection, that this was absolutely necessary. There was in fact a general law which regulated the order of succession in a rigorous manner. To modify this order, in any particular, another law was necessary. This exceptional law was the will. The right of a man to devise by will was not therefore fully accorded, and could not be so long as this society remained under the empire of the old religion. In the belief of these ancient ages, the living man was only the representative, for a few years, of a constant and immortal being, the family. He held the worship and the property only in trust. His right to them ceased with his life. 6. The right of primogeniture. We must transport ourselves beyond the time of which history has preserved the recollection, to those distant ages during which domestic institutions were established and social institutions were prepared. Of this epoch there does not remain, nor can there remain, any written monument, but the laws which then governed men have left some traces in the legislation of succeeding times. In these distant days we distinguish one institution which must have survived a long time, which had a considerable influence upon the future constitution of societies, and without which this constitution could not be explained. This is the right of primogeniture. The old religion established a difference between the older and the younger son. The oldest, said the ancient Aryas, was begotten for the accomplishment of the duty due the ancestors. The others are the fruit of love. In virtue of this original superiority, the oldest had the privilege, after the death of the father, of presiding at all the ceremonies of the domestic worship. He it was who offered the funeral repast and pronounced the formulas of prayer. For the right of pronouncing the prayers belongs to that son who came into the world first. The oldest was, therefore, heir to the hymns, the continuator of the worship, the religious chief of the family. From this creed flowed a rule of law. The oldest alone inherited property. Thus says an ancient passage, which the last editor of the laws of Manu still inserted in the code: "The oldest takes possession of the whole patrimony, and the other brothers live under his authority as if they were under that of their father. The oldest son performs the duties towards the ancestors. He ought therefore to have all." Greek law is derived from the same religious beliefs as Hindu law. It is not astonishing, then, to find here also the right of primogeniture. Sparta preserved it longer than the other Greek cities, because the Spartans were longer faithful to the old institutions. Among them the patrimony was indivisible, and the younger brothers had no part of it. It was the same with many of the ancient codes that Aristotle had studied. He informs us indeed that the Theban code prescribed absolutely that the number of lots of land should remain unchangeable, which certainly excluded the division among brothers. An ancient law of Corinth also provided that the number of families should remain invariable, which could only be the case where the right of the oldest prevented families from becoming dismembered in each generation. Among the Athenians we need not expect to find this old institution in full vigor in the time of Demosthenes. There still existed at this epoch what they called the privilege of the elder. It consisted in retaining, above his proportion, the paternal dwelling, an advantage which was materially considerable, and which was still more considerable in a religious point of view, for the paternal house contained the ancient hearth of the family. While the younger sons, in the time of Demosthenes, left home to light new fires, the oldest, the true heir, remained in possession of the paternal hearth and of the tomb of his ancestors. He alone also preserved the family name. These were the vestiges of a time when he alone received the patrimony. We may remark that the inequality of the law of primogeniture, besides the fact that it did not strike the minds of the ancients, over whom religion was all-powerful, was corrected by several of their customs. Sometimes the younger son was adopted into a family and inherited property there. Sometimes he married an only daughter. Sometimes, in fine, he received some extinct family's lot of land. When all these resources failed, younger sons were sent out to join a colony. As to Rome, we find no law that relates to the right of primogeniture, but we are not to conclude from this that the right was unknown in ancient Italy. It might have disappeared, and even its traces have been effaced. What leads us to believe that before the ages known to us it was in force is that the existence of the Roman and Sabine gens cannot be explained without it. How could a family reach the number of several thousand free persons, like the Claudian family, or several hundred combatants, all patricians, like the Fabian family, if the right of primogeniture had not maintained its unity during a long series of generations, and had not increased its numbers from age to age by preventing its dismemberment? This ancient right of primogeniture is proved by its consequences and, so to speak, by its works. The Ancient City, Book 2, Chapter 8. Authority in the Family. 1. The principle and nature of the paternal power among the ancients. The family did not receive its laws from the city. If the city had established private law, that law would probably have been different from what we have seen. It would have established the right of property and the right of succession on different principles. For it was not the interest of the city that land should be inalienable and the patrimony indivisible. The law that permitted a father to sell or even to kill his son, a law that we find both in Greece and in Rome, was not established by a city. The city would rather have said to the father, "Your wife's and your son's life does not belong to you any more than their liberty does. I will protect them, even against you. You are not the one to judge them or to kill them if they have committed a crime. I will be their judge." If the city did not speak thus, it is evident that it could not. Private law existed before the city. When the city began to write its laws, it found this law already established, living, rooted in the customs, strong by universal observance. The city accepted it, because it could not do otherwise, and dared not modify it, except by degrees. Ancient law was not the work of a legislator. It was, on the contrary, imposed upon the legislator. It had its birth in the family. It sprang up spontaneously from the ancient principles which gave it root. It flowed from the religious belief which was universally admitted in the primitive age of these peoples, which exercised its empire over their intelligence and their wills. A family was composed of a father, a mother, children, and slaves. This group, small as it was, required discipline. To whom then belonged the chief authority? To the father? No. There is in every house something that is above the father himself. It is the domestic religion. It is that God whom the Greeks call the hearth master, estia despina, whom the Romans call lar familiaris. This divinity of the interior, or, what amounts to the same thing, the belief that is in the human soul, is the least doubtful authority. This is what fixed rank in the family. The father ranks first in presence of the sacred fire. He lights it and supports it. He is its priest. In all religious acts, his functions are the highest. He slays the victim. His mouth pronounces the formula of prayer which is to draw upon him and his the protection of the gods. The family and the worship are perpetuated through him. He represents, himself alone, the whole series of ancestors, and from him are to proceed the entire series of descendants. Upon him rests the domestic worship. He can almost say, like the Hindu, "I am the god." When death shall come, he will be a divine being whom his descendants will invoke. This religion did not place woman in so high a rank. The wife takes part in the religious acts, indeed, but she is not the mistress of the hearth. She does not derive her religion from her birth. She was initiated into it at her marriage. She has learned from her husband the prayer that she pronounces. She does not represent the ancestors, since she is not descended from them. She herself will not become an ancestor. Placed in the tomb, she will not receive a special worship. In death, as in life, she counts only as a part of her husband. Greek law, Roman law, and Hindu law, all derived from this old religion, agree in considering the wife as always a minor. She could never have a hearth of her own. She was never the chief of a worship. At Rome she received the title of mater familias, but she lost this if her husband died. Never having a sacred fire which belonged to her, she had nothing of what gave authority in the house. She never commanded. She was never even free or mistress of herself. She was always near the hearth of another, repeating the prayer of another. For all the acts of religious life she needed a superior, and for all the acts of civil life a guardian. The Laws of Manu says, "Woman during her infancy depends upon her father, during her youth upon her husband, when her husband is dead upon her sons, if she has no son, on the nearest relative of her husband, for a woman ought never to govern herself according to her own will." The Greek laws and those of Rome are to the same effect.
As a girl, she is under her father's control. If her father dies, she is governed by her brothers. Married, she is under the guardianship of her husband. If the husband dies, she does not return to her own family, for she has renounced that forever by the sacred marriage. The widow remains subject to the guardianship of her husband's agnates, that is to say, of her own sons, if she has any, or, in default of sons, of the nearest kindred. So complete is her husband's authority over her that he can, upon his death, designate a guardian for her, or even choose her a second husband. To indicate the power of the husband over the wife, the Romans had a very ancient expression, which their jurisconsults have preserved. It is the word manus. It is not easy to discover the primitive sense of this word. The commentators make it the expression of material force, as if the wife was placed under the brutal hand of the husband. It is quite probable that this is wrong. The power of the husband over the wife results in no wise from his superior strength. It came, like all private law, from the religious belief that placed man above woman. What proves this is that a woman who had not been married according to the sacred rites, and who, consequently, had not been associated in the worship, was not subject to the marital power. It was marriage which created this subordination, and at the same time the dignity of the wife. So true is it that the right of the strongest did not constitute the family. Let us pass to the infant. Here nature speaks for itself, loud enough. It demands that the infant shall have a protector, a guide, a master. This religion is in accord with nature. It says that the father shall be the chief of the worship, and that the son shall merely aid him in his sacred functions. But nature requires this subordination only during a certain number of years. Religion requires more. Nature brings the son to his majority. Religion does not grant it to him according to ancient principles. The sacred fire is indivisible. And the same is true of property. The brothers do not separate at the death of their father. For a still stronger reason, they could not separate from him during his life. In the rigor of primitive law, the sons remained attached to the father's hearth, and consequently subject to his authority. While he lived, they were minors. We may suppose that this rule lasted only so long as the old domestic religion remained in full vigor. This unlimited subjection of the son to the father disappeared at an early day in Athens. It subsisted longer at Sparta, where a patrimony was always indivisible. At Rome, the old rule was scrupulously observed. A son could never establish a separate hearth during his father's life, and the father of children, he was still under parental authority. Besides, it was the same with the paternal as with the marital authority. Its principle and condition were the domestic worship. A son born of concubinage was not placed under the authority of the father. Between his father and himself there existed no community of religion. There was nothing, therefore, that conferred authority upon the one or commanded obedience of the other. Paternity of itself gave the father no rights. Thanks to the domestic religion, the family was a small, organized body, a little society, which had its chief and its government. Nothing in modern society can give us an idea of this paternal authority. In primitive antiquity, the father is not alone the strong man, the protector who has the power to command obedience. He is the priest. He is heir to the hearth, the continuator of the ancestors, the parent stock of the descendants, the depositary of the mysterious rites of the worship and of the sacred formulas of prayer. The whole religion resides in him. The very name by which he is called, pater, contains in itself some curious information. The word is the same in Greek, in Latin, and in Sanskrit, from which we may conclude that this word dates from a time when the Hellenes, the Italians, and the Hindus still lived together in Central Asia. What was its signification, and what idea did it then present to the minds of men? We can discover this, for the word has preserved its primary signification in the formulas of religious language and in those of judicial language. When the ancients, invoking Jupiter, called him Pater hominum deorumque, They did not intend to say that Jupiter was the father of gods and men, for they never considered him as such. They believed, on the contrary, that the human race existed before him. The same title, Pater, was given to Neptune, to Apollo, to Bacchus, to Vulcan, and to Pluto. These assuredly men never considered as their fathers. So too the title of Mater was applied to Minerva, Diana, and Vesta, who were reputed 3 virgin goddesses. In judicial language, moreover, the title of Pater, or Pater Familias, might be given to a man who had no children, who was not married, and who was not even of age to contract marriage. The idea of paternity, therefore, was not attached to this word. The Old Language had another word which properly designated the father, and which, as ancient as Pater, is likewise found in the language of the Greeks, of the Romans, and of the Hindus: ganitar, genitor, genitor. The word Pater had another sense. In religious language, they applied it to the gods. In legal language, to every man who had a worship and a domain. The poets show us that they applied it to everyone whom they wished to honor. The slave and the client applied it to their master. It was synonymous with the words rex, anax, vasilens. It contained in itself not the idea of paternity, but that of power, authority, majestic dignity. That such a word should have been applied to the father of a family until it became his most common appellation is assuredly a very significant fact, and one whose importance will appear to all who wish to understand ancient institutions. The history of this word suffices to give us an idea of the power which the father exercised for a long time in the family, and of the sentiment of veneration which was due him as a pontiff and a sovereign. 2. Enumeration of the rights that composed paternal power. Greek and Roman laws recognized in the father this unlimited power with which religion had at first clothed him. The numerous and diverse rights which these laws conferred upon him may be divided into 3 classes, according as we consider the father of the family as a religious chief, as the master of property, or as a judge. First, the father is the supreme chief of the domestic religion. He regulates all the ceremonies of the worship, as he understands them, or rather as he has seen his father perform them. No one contests his sacerdotal supremacy. The city itself and its pontiffs can change nothing in his worship. As priest of the hearth, he recognizes no superior. As religious chief, he is responsible for the perpetuity of the worship, and consequently for that of the family. Whatever affects this perpetuity, which is his first care and his first duty, depends upon him alone. From this flows a whole series of rights. The right to recognize the child at its birth, or to reject it. This right is attributed to the father by the Greek laws, as well as by those of Rome. Barbarous as this is, it is not contrary to the principles on which the family is founded. Even uncontested filiation is not sufficient to admit one into the sacred circle of the family. The consent of its chief, and an initiation into its worship, are necessary. So long as the child is not associated in the domestic religion, he is nothing to the father. The right to repudiate the wife, either in case of sterility, because the family must not become extinct, or in case of adultery, because the family and the descendants ought to be free of all debasement. The right to give his daughter in marriage, that is to say, to cede to another the power which he has over her. The right of marrying his son. The marriage of the son concerns the perpetuity of the family. The right to emancipate, that is to say, to exclude a son from the family and the worship. The right to adopt, that is to say, to introduce a stranger to the domestic hearth. The right at his death of naming a guardian for his wife and children. It is necessary to remark that all these rights belonged to the father alone, to the exclusion of all the other members of the family. The wife had not the right of divorce, at least in primitive times. Even when a widow, she could neither emancipate nor adopt. She was never the guardian even of her own children. In case of divorce, the children remained with the father, even the daughters. Her children were never in her power. Her consent was not asked for the marriage of her own daughter. Second, we have seen above that property was not understood originally as an individual right, but as a family right. The fortune, as Plato says, formally, and as all ancient legislators say implicitly, belongs to the ancestors and the descendants. This property by its very nature could not be divided. There could be in each family but one proprietor, which was the family itself, and only one to enjoy the use of that property, the father. This principle explains several peculiarities of ancient law. The property not being capable of division and resting entirely on the head of the father, neither wife nor children had the least part in it. The dotal system, and even the community of goods, were then unknown. The dowry of the wife belonged without reserve to the husband, who exercised over her dowry not only the rights of an administrator, but of an owner. Whatever the wife might have acquired during her marriage fell into the hands of her husband. She did not even recover her dower on becoming a widow. The son was in the same condition as the wife. He owned nothing. No donation made by him was valid, since he had nothing of his own. He could acquire nothing. The fruits of his labor, the profits of his trade, were his father's. If a will was made in his favor by a stranger, his father, not himself, received the legacy. This explains the provision of the Roman law which forbade all contracts of sale between father and son. If the father sold to the son, he sold to himself, as the son acquired only for the father. We see in the Roman laws, and we find also in the laws of Athens, that a father could sell his son. This was because the father might dispose of all the property of the family, and the son might be looked upon as property, since his labor was a source of income. The father might, therefore, according to choice, keep this instrument of labor, or resign it to another. To resign it was called selling the son. The texts of the Roman law that we have do not inform us clearly as to the nature of this contract of sale, nor on the reservations that might have been contained in it. It appears certain that the son thus sold did not become the slave of the purchaser. His liberty was not sold, only his labor. Even in this state the son remained subject to the paternal authority, which proves that he was not considered to have left the family. We may suppose that this sale had no other effect than to cede the possession of the son for a time by a sort of contract to hire. Later it was employed only as an indirect means of emancipating the son. Third, Plutarch informs us that at Rome women could not appear in court even as witnesses. We read in the Jurisconsult Gaius, "It should be known that nothing can be granted in the way of justice to persons under power, that is to say, to wives, sons, and slaves. For it is reasonably concluded that, since these persons can own no property, neither can they reclaim anything in point of justice. If a son, subject to his father's will, has committed a crime, the action lies against the father, nor has the father himself any action against his son." From all this it is clear that the wife and the son could not be plaintiffs or defendants, or accusers or accused, or witnesses. Of all the family, the father alone could appear before the tribunal of the city. Public justice existed only for him, and he alone was responsible for the crimes committed by his family. Justice for wife and son was not in the city, because it was in the house. The chief of the family was their judge, placed upon a judgment seat in virtue of his marital and parental authority, in the name of the family and under the eyes of the domestic divinities. Livy relates that the Senate, wishing to extirpate the worship of Bacchus from Rome, decreed the punishment of death against all who had taken part in it. The decree was easily executed upon the citizens, but when it came to the women, who were not the least guilty, a grave difficulty presented itself. The women were not answerable to the state. The family alone had the right to judge them. The Senate respected this old principle, and left to the fathers and husbands the duty of pronouncing the sentence of death against the women. This judicial authority which the chief of the family exercised in his house was complete and without appeal. He could condemn to death like the magistrate in the city, and no authority could modify his sentence. The husband, says Cato the Elder, is the judge of his wife. His power has no limit. He can do what he wishes. If she has committed a fault, he punishes her. If she has drank wine, he condemns her. If she has been guilty of adultery, he kills her. The right was the same in regard to children. Valerius Maximus cites a certain Attilius, who killed his daughter as guilty of unchastity, and everybody will recall the father who put his son, an accomplice to Catiline, to death. Facts of this nature are numerous in Roman history. It would be a false idea to suppose that the father had an absolute right to kill his wife and children. He was their judge. If he put them to death, it was only by virtue of his right as judge. As the father of the family was alone subject to the judgment of the city, the wife and the son could have no other judge than him. Within his family, he was the only magistrate. We must also remark that the paternal authority was not an arbitrary power, like that which would be derived from the right of the strongest. It had its foundation in a belief which all shared alike, and it found its limits in this same belief. For example, the father had the right to exclude his son from the family, but he well knew that if he did this, the family ran a risk of becoming extinct, and the manas of his ancestors of falling into eternal oblivion. He had the right to adopt a stranger, but religion forbade him to do this if he had a son. He was sole proprietor of the goods, but he had not, at least originally, a right to alienate them. He could repudiate his wife, but to do this he had to break the religious bond which marriage had established. Thus, religion imposed upon the father as many obligations as it conferred rights. Such, for a long time, was the ancient family. The spiritual belief was sufficient without the need of the law of force, or of the authority of a social power to constitute it regularly, to give it a discipline, a government and justice, and to establish private law in all its details. The Ancient City, Book 2, Chapter 9, Morals of the Ancient Family. History does not study material facts and institutions alone. Its true object of study is the human mind. It should aspire to know what this mind has believed, thought, and felt in the different ages of the life of the human race. We described, at the opening of this book, the ancient opinion which men held concerning their destiny after death. We have shown how this creed produced domestic institutions and private law. It remains to discover what its action was upon morals in primitive societies. Without pretending that this old religion created moral sentiments in the heart of man, we may at least believe that it was associated with them to fortify them, to give them greater authority, to assure their supremacy and their right of direction over the conduct of men, sometimes also to give them a false bias. The religion of these primitive ages was exclusively domestic. So also were morals. Religion did not say to a man, showing him another man, "That is thy brother." It said to him, "That is a stranger. He cannot participate in the religious acts of thy hearth. He cannot approach the tomb of thy family. He has other gods than thine, and cannot unite with thee in a common prayer. Thy gods reject his adoration and regard him as their enemy. He is thy foe also." In this religion of the hearth, man never supplicates the divinity in favor of other men. He invokes him only for himself and his. A Greek proverb has remained as a souvenir and a vestige of this ancient isolation of man in prayer. In Plutarch's time they still said to the egotist, "You sacrifice to the hearth." This signified, "You separate yourself from other citizens. You have no friends. Your fellow men are nothing to you. You live solely for yourself and yours." This proverb pointed to a time when, all religion being around the hearth, the horizon of morals and of affection had not yet passed beyond the narrow circle of the family. It is natural that moral ideas, like religious ideas, should have their commencement and progress, and the God of the primitive generations in this race was very small. By degrees men made him larger. So morals, very narrow and incomplete at first, became insensibly enlarged, until, from stage to stage, they reached the point of proclaiming the duty of love towards all mankind. The point of departure was the family, and it was under the influence of the domestic religion that duties first appeared to the eyes of man. Let us picture to ourselves this religion of the fire and of the tomb in its flourishing period. Man sees a divinity near him. It is present, like conscience itself, to his minutest actions. This fragile being finds himself under the eye of a witness who never leaves him. He never feels himself alone. At his side in the house, in the field, he has protectors to sustain him in the toils of life, and judges to punish his guilty actions. The Lares, said the Romans, are formidable divinities, whose duty it is to punish mankind and to watch over all that passes in the interior of the house. The Penates they also describe as gods who enable us to live. They nourish our bodies and regulate our minds. Men loved to apply to the holy fire the epithet of chaste, and they believed that it enjoined chastity upon mortals. No act materially or morally impure could be committed in its presence. The first ideas of wrong, of chastisement, of expiation seem to have come from this. The man who felt guilty no longer dared to approach his own hearth. His God repelled him. He who had shed blood was no longer allowed to sacrifice, or to offer libations, or prayer, or to offer the sacred repast. The God was so severe that he admitted no excuse. He did not distinguish between an involuntary murder and a premeditated crime. The hand stained with blood could no longer touch sacred objects. To enable a man to renew his worship and to regain possession of his God, he was required at least to purify himself by an expiatory ceremony. This religion knew pity, and had rites to efface the stains of the soul. Narrow and material as it was, it still knew how to console man for his errors. If it absolutely ignored the duties of charity, at any rate it traced for man with admirable precision his family duties. It rendered marriage obligatory. Celibacy was a crime in the eyes of a religion that made the perpetuity of the family the first and most holy of duties. But the union which it prescribed could be accomplished only in the presence of the domestic divinities. It is the religious, sacred, indissoluble union of the husband and wife. No man could omit the rites and make of marriage a simple contract by consent, as it became in the latest period of Greek and Roman society. This ancient religion forbade it, and if one dared to offend in this particular, it punished him for it. For the son sprung from such a union was considered a bastard, that is to say, a being who had neither place nor sacred fire. He had no right to perform any sacred act. He could not pray. This same religion watched with care over the purity of the family. In its eyes, the greatest of crimes was adultery. For the first rule of the worship was that the sacred fire should be transmitted from father to son, and adultery disturbed the order of birth. Another rule was that the tomb should contain only members of the family, but the son born of adultery was a stranger. If he was buried in the tomb, all the principles of the religion were violated, the worship defiled, the sacred fire became impure. Every offering at the tomb became an act of impiety. Worse still, by adultery, the series of descendants was broken. The family, even though living men knew it not, became extinct, and there was no more divine happiness for the ancestors. The Hindu also says, "The son born of adultery annihilates in this world and in the next the offerings made to the manas." Here is the reason that the laws of Greece and Rome give the father the right to reject the child just born. Here, too, is the reason that they are so rigorous, so inexorable against adultery. At Athens, the husband is allowed to kill the guilty one. At Rome, the husband, as the wife's judge, condemns her to death. This religion was so severe that a man had not even the right to pardon completely, and that he was forced at least to repudiate his wife. These, then, are the first moral and domestic laws discovered and sanctioned. Here is, besides the natural sentiment, an imperious religion which tells the husband and wife that they are united forever, and that from this union flow rigorous duties, the neglect of which brings with it the gravest consequences in this life and in the next. Hence came the serious and sacred character of the conjugal union among the ancients, and the purity which the family long preserved. This domestic morality prescribed still other duties. It taught the wife that she ought to obey, the husband that he ought to command. It instructed both to respect each other. The wife had rights, for she had her place at the sacred fire. It was her duty to see that it did not die out. She too then has her priesthood. Where she is not found, the domestic worship is incomplete and insufficient. It was a great misfortune to a Greek to have a hearth deprived of a wife. Among the Romans, the presence of the wife was so necessary in the sacrifices that the priest lost his office on becoming a widower. It was doubtless to this division of the domestic priesthood that the mother of the family owed the veneration with which they never ceased to surround her in Greek and Roman society. Hence it came that the wife had the same title in the family as the husband. The Romans said pater familias and mater familias, the Greeks ekodeopis and ekodeopina, the Hindus grihapati and grihapatni. Hence also came this formula which the wife pronounced in the Roman marriage, ubi tu caius ego caia, a formula which tells us that, if in the house there was not equal authority, there was equal dignity. As to the son, we have seen him subject to the authority of a father who could sell him or condemn him to death. But this son had also his part in the worship. He filled a place in the religious ceremonies. His presence on certain days was so necessary that the Roman who had no son was forced to adopt a fictitious one for those days in order that the rites might be performed. And here religion established a very powerful bond between father and son. They believed in a second life in the tomb, a life happy and calm if the funeral repasts were regularly offered. Thus the father is convinced that his destiny after this life will depend upon the care that his son will take of his tomb. And the son on his part is convinced that his father will become a god after death, whom he will have to invoke. We can imagine how much respect and reciprocal affection this belief would establish in the family. The ancients gave to the domestic virtues the name of piety, the obedience of the son to his father, the love which he bore to his mother. This was piety, pietas erga parentes. The attachment of the father for the child, the tenderness of the mother, these too were piety, pietas erga liberos. Everything in the family was divine. The sense of duty, natural affection, the religious idea, all these were confounded, were considered as one, and were expressed by the same word. It will perhaps appear strange to find love of home counted among the virtues, but it was so counted among the ancients. This sentiment had a deep and powerful hold upon their minds. Anchises, when he sees Troy in flames, is still unwilling to leave his old home. Ulysses, when countless treasures and immortality itself are offered him, wishes only again to see the flame of his own hearth fire. Let us come down to Cicero's time. It is no longer a poet but a statesman who speaks. Here is my religion. Here is my race. Here are the traces of my forefathers. I cannot express the charm which I find here, and which penetrates my heart and my senses. We must place ourselves, in thought, in the midst of these primitive generations to understand how lively and powerful were these sentiments, which were already enfeebled in Cicero's day. For us the house is merely a domicile, a shelter. We leave it and forget it with little trouble, or, if we are attached to it, this is merely by the force of habit or of recollections, because for us religion is not there. Our God is the God of the universe, and we find him everywhere. It was entirely different among the ancients. They found their principal divinity within the house. This was their providence, which protected them individually, which heard their prayers and granted their wishes. Out of the house, man no longer felt the presence of a god. The god of his neighbor was a hostile god. Then a man loved his house as he now loves his church. Thus the religion of the primitive ages was not foreign to the moral development of this part of humanity. Their gods enjoined purity and forbade the shedding of blood. The notion of justice, if it was not born of this belief, must at least have been fortified by it. These gods belonged in common to all the members of the same family. Thus the family was united by a powerful tie, and all its members learned to love and respect each other. These gods lived in the interior of each house. A man loved his house, his home, fixed and durable, which he had received from his ancestors, and which he transmitted to his children as a sanctuary. Ancient morality, governed by this belief, knew no charity, but it taught at least the domestic virtues. Among this race, the isolation of the family was the commencement of morals. Duties, clear, precise, and imperious, appeared, but they were restricted within a narrow circle. This narrow character of primitive morals we must recollect as we proceed, for civil society, founded later on these same principles, put on the same character, and several singular traits of ancient politics are explained by this fact. Footnote: what is said of ancient morals in this chapter is intended to apply to those peoples that afterwards became Greeks and Romans. This morality was modified with time, especially among the Greeks. Already in the Odyssey we find new sentiments and other manners. Book 2, Chapter 10. The Gens at Rome and in Greece. We find in the writings of Roman jurists and in Greek writers the traces of an antique institution which appears to have had its flourishing period in the first ages of Greek and Italian societies, but which, becoming enfeebled by degrees, left vestiges that were hardly perceptible in the later portion of their history. We speak of what the Romans called gens, and the Greeks genos. As the nature and constitution of the gens have been much discussed, it may not be amiss here to point out what has constituted the difficulty of the problem. The gens, as we shall see presently, formed a body whose constitution was radically aristocratic. It was through their internal organization that the patriarchs of Rome and the eupatrids of Athens were able to perpetuate their privileges for so long a time. No sooner had the popular party gained the upper hand than they attacked this old institution with all their power. If they had been able completely to destroy it, they would probably not have left us the slightest memorial of it. But it was singularly endowed with vitality, and deeply rooted in their manners, and they could not entirely blot it out. They therefore contented themselves with modifying it. They took away its essential character, and left only its external features, which were not in the way of the new regime. Thus, at Rome, the plebeians undertook to form gentes, in imitation of the patricians. At Athens, they attempted to overthrow the gentes, to blend them together, and to replace them by the demes, which were established in imitation of them. We shall have to return to the subject when we speak of the revolutions. Let it suffice here for us to remark that this profound alteration which the democracy introduced into the regime of the gens is of a nature to mislead those who undertake to learn its primitive constitution. Indeed, almost all of the information concerning it that has come down to us dates from the epoch when it had been thus transformed, and shows us only that part which the revolutions had allowed to subsist. Let us suppose that 20 centuries hence all knowledge of the Middle Ages has perished, that there remain no documents relating to what passed before the Revolution of 1789, and that, notwithstanding this, an historian of that time wishes to form an idea of institutions of an earlier date. The only documents that he would have at hand would show him the nobility of the 19th century, that is to say, something very different from that of feudalism. But he would suspect that a great revolution had taken place, and he would rightly conclude that this institution, like all the others, must have been modified. This nobility, which his authorities would describe to him, would no longer be for him anything but the shadow or the enfeebled and altered image of another nobility, incomparably more powerful. Finally, if he examined with attention the slight remains of ancient monuments, a few expressions preserved in the language, a few terms escaped from the law, vague souvenirs or sterile regrets, he would perhaps be able to conjecture something concerning the feudal system, and would obtain an idea of the institutions of the Middle Ages that would not be very far from the truth. The difficulty would assuredly be great, nor is it less for him who today desires to understand the antique gens, for he has no information regarding it except what dates from a time when it was no longer anything but a shadow of itself. We will commence by analyzing all that the ancient writers tell us of the gens, that is to say, what remained of it at the epoch when it was already greatly changed. Then, by the aid of these remains, we shall attempt to catch a glimpse of the veritable system of the antique gens. 1. What ancient writers tell us of the gens. If we open a Roman history at the time of the Punic Wars, we meet three personages whose names are Claudius Pulcher, Claudius Nero, and Claudius Cantho. All three belong to the same gens, the Claudian gens. Demosthenes, in one of his orations, produces 7 witnesses who certify that they belong to the same genos, that of the Britidae. What is remarkable in this example is that the 7 persons cited as members of the same genos are inscribed in 6 different demes. This shows that the genos did not correspond exactly with the deme, and was not, like it, a simple administrative division. Here is one fact established. There were gentes at Rome and at Athens. We might cite examples relative to many other cities of Greece and Italy, and conclude from them that, in all probability, this institution was universal among these ancient nations. Every gens had a special worship. In Greece, the members of the same gens were recognized by the fact that they had performed sacrifices in common from a very early period. Plutarch speaks of the place where the Lycomedae, and Aeschines speaks of the altar of the gens of the Butidae. At Rome, too, each gens had religious ceremonies to perform. The day, the place, and the rites were fixed by its particular religion. When the capital is besieged by the Gauls, one of the Fabii, clothed in religious robes and carrying sacred objects in his hands, is seen to go out and cross the enemy's lines. He goes to offer sacrifice on the altar of his gens, which is situated on the Quirinal. In the Second Punic War, another Fabius, whom they called the Shield of Rome, is making head against Hannibal. Certainly it is of the first importance to the Republic that he remains with his army, and yet he leaves it in the hands of the imprudent Minucius. This is because the anniversary of the sacrifice of his gens has arrived, and he must be at Rome to perform the sacred act. It was a duty to perpetuate this worship from generation to generation, and every man was required to leave sons after him to continue it. Claudius, a personal enemy of Cicero, abandoned his gens to enter a plebeian family, and Cicero says to him, "Why do you expose the religion of the Claudian gens to the risk of becoming extinct through your fault?" The gods of the gens, dii gentilis, protected no other gens, and did not desire to be invoked by another. No stranger could be admitted to the religious ceremonies. It was believed that if a stranger had a part of the victim, or even if he merely assisted at the sacrifice, the gods of the gens were offended, and all the members were guilty of grave impiety. Just as every gens had its worship and its religious festivals, so also it had its common tomb. We read in an oration of Demosthenes, "This man, having lost his children, buried them in the tomb of his fathers, in that tomb that is common to all those of his gens." The rest of the oration shows that no stranger could be buried in this tomb. In another discourse, the same orator speaks of the tomb where the gens of the Bucellidae buried its members, and where every year it performed its funeral sacrifices. This burial place is a large field surrounded with an enclosure, according to the ancient custom. The same was the case among the Romans. Velleius Paterculus speaks of the tomb of the Quintilian gens, and Suetonius informs us that the Claudian gens had one on the slope of the Capitoline Hill. The ancient law of Rome permits the members of a gens to inherit from each other. The 12 Tables declare that, in default of sons and of agnates, the gentilis is the natural heir. According to this code, therefore, the gentiles are nearer akin than the cognates, that is to say, nearer than those related through females. Nothing is more closely united than the members of a gens. United in the celebration of the same sacred ceremonies, they mutually aid each other in all the needs of life. The entire gens is responsible for the debt of one of its members. It redeems the prisoner and pays the fine of one condemned. If one of its members becomes a magistrate, it unites to pay the expenses incident to the magistracy. The accused was accompanied to the tribunal by all the members of his gens. This marks the close relation which the law established between a man and the body of which he formed a part. For a man to plead or bear witness against one of his own gens was an act contrary to religion. A certain Claudius, a man of some rank, was a personal enemy of Appius Claudius the Decemvir. Yet when the latter was placed on trial and was menaced with death, this Claudius appeared in his defense and implored the people in his favor, but not without giving them notice that he took this step, not on account of any affection which he bore the accused, but as a duty. If a member of a gens could not accuse another member before a tribunal of the city, this was because there was a tribunal in the gens itself. Each gens had its chief, who was at the same time its judge, its priest, and its military commander. Everyone knows that when the Sabine family of the Claudi established itself at Rome, the 3,000 persons who composed it obeyed a single chief. Later, when the Fabii took upon themselves the whole war against the Veientes, we see that this gens had its chief, who spoke in its name before the Senate, and who led it against the enemy. In Greece, too, the gens had its chief. The inscriptions confirm this, and they show us that this chief generally bore the title of archon. Finally, in Rome, as in Greece, the gens had its assemblies. It passed laws which its members were bound to obey, and which the city itself respected. Such are the usages and laws which we find still in force at an epoch when the gens was already enfeebled and almost destroyed. Such are the remains of this ancient institution. 2. An examination of certain opinions that have been put forth to explain the Roman gens. On this subject, which has long been the theme of learned controversy, several theories have been offered. Some say that the gens was nothing more than a similarity in name. Others, that the word gens designated a sort of factitious relationship. Still others hold that the gens was merely the expression of a relation between a family which acted as patrons and other families that were clients. But none of these explanations answer to the whole series of facts, laws, and usages which we have just enumerated. Another opinion, more plausible, is that the gens was a political association of several families who were originally strangers to each other, and that, in default of ties of blood, the city established among them an imaginary union and a sort of religious relationship. But a first objection presents itself. If the gens is only a factitious association, how are we to explain the fact that its members inherited from each other? Why is the gentilis preferred to the cognate? It has been seen above what the rules of succession were. and we have pointed out the close and necessary relation which religion had established between the right of inheritance and masculine kinship. Can we suppose the ancient law deviated so far from this principle as to accord the right of succession to the gentiles if they had been strangers to each other? The best established and most prominent characteristic of the gens is that, like the family, it had a worship. Now, if we inquire what god each adores, we find almost always that it is a deified ancestor, and that the altar where the sacrifice is offered is a tomb. At Athens, the Eumolpidae worshipped Eumolpus, the author of their race. The Phytalidae adored the hero Phytalus, the Butidae, Butes, the Bucelidae, Bucellus, the Lachiadae, Lachios, and the Amenandridae, Cecrops. At Rome, the Claudi are descended from a Clausus, the Caeculi honored as the chief of their race the hero Caeculus, the Calpurni a Calpus, the Julii a Jullus, the Cloeli a Cloellus. We may easily suppose it is true that many of these genealogies were an afterthought, but we must admit that this sort of imposture would have had no motive if it had not been a constant usage among the real gentes to recognize and to worship a common ancestor. Falsehood always seeks to imitate the truth. Besides, the imposture was not so easy as it might seem to us. This worship was not a vain formality for parade. One of the most rigorous rules of the religion was that no one should honor as an ancestor any except those from whom he was really descended. To offer this worship to a stranger was a grave impiety. If, then, the members of a gens adored a common ancestor, it was because they really believed they were descended from him. To counterfeit a tomb, to establish anniversaries and an annual worship, would have been to carry falsehood into what they held most dear, and to trifle with religion. Such a fiction was possible in the time of Caesar, when the old family religion was cherished by nobody. But if we go back to the time when this creed was in its vigor, we cannot imagine that several families, taking part in the same imposture, could say to each other, "We will pretend to have a common ancestor, we will erect him a tomb, we will offer him funeral repasts, and our descendants shall adore him in all future time." Such a thought could not have presented itself to their minds, or it would have been scouted as an impiety. In the difficult problems often found in history, it is well to seek from the terms of language all the instruction which they can afford. An institution is sometimes explained by the word that designates it. Now the word gens means exactly the same as the word genus. So completely alike are they that we can take the one for the other, and say indifferently, gens fabia and genus fabium. Both correspond to the verb gignere and the substantive genitor, precisely as genos corresponds to genan and to gonens. All these words convey the same idea of filiation. The Greeks also designated the member of a genos by the word homogalactis, which signifies nourished by the same milk. Let these words be compared with those which we are accustomed to translate by family, the Latin familia, the Greek oikos. Neither of these last has the sense of generation or of kinship. The true signification of familia is property. It designates the field, the house, money, and slaves, and it is for this reason that the 12 tables say, in speaking of the heir, familiam nuncitur, let him take the succession. As to oikos, it is clear that this word presents to the mind no other idea than that of property or of domicile. And yet these are the words that we habitually translate by family. Now, is it admissible that terms whose intrinsic meaning is that of domicile or property were often used to designate a family, and that other words whose primary sense is filiation, birth, paternity, have never designated anything but an artificial association? Certainly this would not be in conformity with the logic, so direct and clear, of the ancient languages. It is unquestionable that the Greeks and the Romans attached to the words gens and genos the idea of a common origin. This idea might have become obscured after the gens was modified, but the word has remained to bear witness of it. The theory that presents the gens as a factitious association has against it, therefore, first, the old legislation, which gives the gentiles the right of inheritance. Second, the old religion, which allowed a common worship only where there was a common parentage. Third, the terms of the language, which attest in the gens a common origin. The theory has also this other defect, that it supposes human societies to have commenced by a convention and an artifice, a position which historical science cannot admit as true. 3. The gens is the family, still holding its primitive organization and its unity. All the evidence presents us the gens as united by the tie of birth. Let us again consult language. The names of the gentes, in Greece as well as in Rome, all have the form which was used in the two languages for patronymics. Claudius signifies the son of Clausus, and Butidae the sons of Butes. Those who think they see in the gens an artificial association set out from a false assumption. They suppose that a gens always consisted of several families having different names, and they cite the Cornelian gens, which did indeed include Scipios, Lentuli, Cossi, and Scyllae. But this is very far from having been a general rule. The Marcian gens appears never to have had more than a single line. We also find but one in the Lucretian gens, and but one in the Quintilian gens, for a long time. It would certainly be very difficult to tell what families composed the Fabian gens, for all the Fabii known in history belong manifestly to the same stock. At first they all bear the surname of Vibulanus. They all change it afterwards for that of Ambustus, which they replace still later by Maximus or Dorso. We know that it was customary at Rome for all patricians to have 3 names. One was called, for example, Publius Cornelius Scipio. It might be worthwhile to inquire which of these 3 names was considered as the true name. Publius was merely a name placed before, praenomen. Scipio was a name added, agnomen. The true name was Cornelius, and this name was at the same time that of the whole gens. Had we only this single indication regarding the ancient gens, it would justify us in affirming that there were Cornelii before there were Scipios, and not, as it is often said, that the family of the Scipios associated with others to form the Cornelian gens. History teaches us, in fact, that the Cornelian gens was, for a long time, undivided, and that all the members alike bore the surname of Maluginensis, and that of Cossus. It was not till the time of the dictator Camillus that one of its branches adopted the surname of Scipio. A little later, another branch took the surname of Rufus, which it replaced afterwards by that of Sylla. The Lentuli do not appear till the time of the Samnite Wars, the Cathegi not until the Second Punic War. It is the same with the Claudian gens. The Claudii remained a long time united in a single family, and all bore the surname of Sabinus, or of Regalensis, a sign of their origin. We follow them for 7 generations without seeing any branches formed in this family, although it had become very numerous. It was only in the 8th, that is to say, in the time of the First Punic War, that we see 3 branches separate and adopt 3 surnames, which became hereditary with them. These were the Pulchri, who continued during 2 centuries, the Kenthos, who soon became extinct, and the Neros, who continued to the time of the Empire. From all this, it is clear that the gens was not an association of families, but that it was the family itself. It might either comprise only a single line or produce several branches. It was always but one family. Besides, it is easy to account for the formation of the antique gens, and for its nature, if we but refer to the old belief and to the old institutions that we have already described. We shall see even that the gens is derived very naturally from the domestic religion and from the private law of the ancient ages. Indeed, what did this primitive religion prescribe? That the ancestor, that is to say, the man who was first buried in the tomb, should be perpetually honored as a god, and that his descendants, assembled every year near the sacred place where he reposed, should offer him the funeral repast. This fire always kept burning, this tomb always honored with a worship, were the center around which all later generations came to live, and by which all the branches of the family, however numerous they might be, remained grouped in a single body. What more does private law tell us of those ancient ages? While studying the nature of authority in the ancient family, we saw that the son did not separate from the father. While studying the rules for the transmission of the patrimony, we saw that, on account of the right of primogeniture, the younger brothers did not separate from the oldest. Hearth, tomb, patrimony, all these, in the beginning, were indivisible. The family, consequently, was also indivisible. Time did not dismember it. This indivisible family, which developed through ages, perpetuating its worship and its name from century to century, was really the antique gens. The gens was the family, but the family, having preserved the unity which its religion enjoined, and having attained all the development which ancient private law permitted it to attain. Footnote. We need not repeat what we have already said of agnation. See Book 2, Chapter 5. We can see that agnatio and gentilitas, the relationship of the gentiles, flowed from the same principles and were relationships of the same nature. The passage in the law of the 12 tables which assigns the inheritance to the gentiles in default of agnati embarrassed the jurisconsults and led to the opinion that there was an essential difference between these two kinds of kinship. But this difference is nowhere found. One was agnatus as one was gentilis, by masculine descent and the religious bond. There was only a difference of degree, which began when the branches of the same gens were separated. The agnatus was a member of the branch, the gentilis of the gens. There was therefore the same distinction between the terms gentilis and agnatus as between the words gens and familia. Familiam dicimus omnium agnatorum, says Ulpian in the Digest. One, when he wasn't the agnate of a man, was, for a still stronger reason, his gentilis. But he could not be a gentilis without being an agnate. The law of the 12 tables gave the inheritance, in default of agnates, to those who were only gentilis of the deceased, that is to say, who were of his gens without being of his branch or of his familia. End of footnote. This truth admitted, all that the ancient writers have told us of the gens becomes clear. The close unity which we have remarked among its members is no longer surprising. They are related by birth, and the worship which they practice in common is not a fiction, it comes to them from their ancestors. As they are a single family, they have a common tomb. For the same reason, the law of the 12 tables declares them qualified to inherit each other's property. For the same reason, too, they bear the same name. As all had, in the beginning, a single undivided patrimony, it was a custom, and even a necessity, that the entire gens should be answerable for the debt of one of its members, and that they should pay the ransom of the prisoner and the fine of the convict. All these rules became established of themselves while the gens still retained its unity. When it was dismembered, they could not disappear entirely. Of the ancient and sacred unity of this family, there remain persistent traces in the annual sacrifices which assembled the scattered members, in the name that remained common to them, in the legislation which recognized the right of gentiles to inherit, in their customs which enjoined them to aid each other. Footnote: the use of patronymics dates from this high antiquity and is connected with this old religion. Every gens transmitted the name of the ancestor from generation to generation with the same care as it perpetuated its worship. What the Romans called nomen was this name of the ancestor which all the members of the gens bore. A day came when each branch, becoming independent in certain respects, marked its individuality by adopting a surname, cognomen. Each person was, moreover, distinguished by a particular denomination, agnomen, as Caius or Quintus. But the true name, the official name, the sacred name, was that of the gens. This, coming from the first known ancestor, was to last as long as the family and the gods lasted. It was the same in Greece. Every Greek, at least if he belonged to an ancient and regularly established family, had, like the Roman patrician, 3 names. One was his individual name, another was that of his father, and as these two generally alternated with each other, they were together equivalent to the hereditary cognomen, which at Rome designated a branch of the gens. Lastly, the third name was that of the entire gens. Examples: Miltiades Kimonos Lakiadis, and, in the following generation, Kaimon Miltiado Lakiadis. The Lakiadae formed a genos, as the Cornelii formed a gens. It was the same with the Butidae and the Phytalidae, etc. Pindar never extols his heroes without recalling the name of their genos. This name, in Greek, usually ended in idis or adis, and thus had an adjective form, just as the name of the gens among the Romans invariably ended in ius. This was nonetheless the true name. In daily life, a man might be called by his individual surname, but in the official language of politics or religion, his complete name, and above all, the name of the genos, was required. Later, the democracy substituted the name of the deme for that of the genos. The history of names followed a different course in ancient from what it has followed in modern times. In the Middle Ages, until the 12th century, the true name was the individual or baptismal name. Patronymics came quite late, as names of estates or surnames. It was just the reverse among the ancients, and this difference is due to the difference of the two religions. For the old domestic religion, the family was the true body, of which the individual was but an inseparable member. The patronymic was, therefore, the first name in date and in importance. The new religion, on the contrary, recognized in the individual complete liberty and entire personal independence, and was not in the least opposed to separating him from the family. Baptismal names were, therefore, the first, and for a long time the only, names. End of footnote. 4. The family, gens, was at first the only form of society. What we have seen of the family, its domestic religion, the gods which it had created for itself, the laws that it had established, the right of primogeniture on which it had been founded, its unity, its development from age to age until the formation of the gens, its justice, its priesthood, its internal government, carries us forcibly in thought towards a primitive epoch when the family was independent of all superior power and when the city did not yet exist. When we examine the domestic religion, those gods who belonged only to one family and exercised their providence only within the walls of one house, this worship which was secret, this religion which would not be propagated, this antique morality which prescribed the isolation of families, it is clear that beliefs of this nature could not have taken root in the minds of men, except in an age when larger societies were not yet formed. If the religious sentiment was satisfied with so narrow a conception of the divine, it was because human associations were then narrow in proportion. The time when men believed only in the domestic gods was the time when there existed only families. It is quite true that this belief might have subsisted afterwards, and even for a long time, when cities and nations existed. Man does not easily free himself from opinions that have once exercised a strong influence over him. This belief might endure, therefore, even when it was in disaccord with the social state. What is there indeed more contradictory than to live in a civil society and to have particular gods in each family? But it is clear that this contradiction did not always exist, and that at the epoch when this belief was established in the mind, and became powerful enough to form a religion, it corresponded exactly with the social state of man. Now, the only social state that is in accord with such a belief is that in which the family lives independent and isolated. In such a state, the whole Aryan race appears to have lived for a long time. The hymns of the Vedas confirm this for the branch from which the Hindus are descended, and the old beliefs and the old private laws attest it for those who finally became Greeks and Romans. If we compare the political institutions of the Aryas of the East with those of the Aryas of the West, we find hardly any analogy between them. If, on the contrary, we compare the domestic institutions of these various nations, we perceive that the family was constituted upon the same principles in Greece and in India. Besides, these principles were, as we have already shown, of so singular a nature that we cannot suppose this resemblance to have been the work of chance. Finally, not only do these institutions offer an evident analogy, but even the words that designate them are often the same in the different languages, which this race has spoken from the Ganges to the Tiber. From this fact we may draw a double conclusion. One is that the origin of domestic institutions among the nations of this race is anterior to the period when its different branches separated. The other is that the origin of political institutions is, on the contrary, later than this separation. The first were fixed from the time when the race still lived in its ancient cradle of Central Asia. The second were formed by degrees in the different countries to which its migrations conducted. We can catch a glimpse, therefore, of a long period during which men knew no other form of society than the family. Then arose the domestic religion, which could not have taken root in a society otherwise constituted, and which must long have been an obstacle to social development. Then also was established ancient private law, which was found later to be in disaccord with the interests of a more extended social organization, but which was in perfect harmony with the state of society in which it arose. Let us place ourselves in thought, therefore, in the midst of those ancient generations whose traces have not been entirely effaced, and who delegated their beliefs and their laws to subsequent ages. Each family has its religion, its gods, its priesthood. Religious isolation is a law with it. Its ceremonies are secret. In death even, or in the existence that follows it, families do not mingle. Each one continues to live apart in the tomb, from which the stranger is excluded. Every family has also its property, that is to say, its lot of land, which is inseparably attached to it by its religion. Its gods, termini, guard the enclosure, and its manas keep it in their care. Isolation of property is so obligatory that two domains cannot be contiguous, but a band of soil must be left between them, which must be neutral ground and must remain inviolable. Finally, every family has its chief, as a nation would have its king. It has its laws, which doubtless are unwritten, but which religious faith engraves in the heart of every man. It has its court of justice, above which there is no other that one can appeal to.
Whatever a man really needs for his material or moral life, the family possesses within itself. It needs nothing from without. It is an organized state, a society that suffices for itself. But this family of the ancient ages is not reduced to the proportions of the modern family. In larger societies, the family separates and decreases, but in the absence of every other social organization, it extends, develops, and ramifies without becoming divided. Several younger branches remain grouped around an older one, near the one sacred fire and the common tomb. Still another element entered into the composition of this antique family: the reciprocal need which the poor has of the rich, and the rich has of the poor, makes servants. But in this sort of patriarchal regime, servant and slave were one. We can see indeed that the principle of a free and voluntary service, ceasing at the will of the servant, would ill accord with a social state in which a family lived isolated. Besides, the domestic religion did not permit strangers to be admitted into a family. By some means, then, the servant must become a member and an integrant part of the family. This was effected by a sort of initiation of the newcomer into the domestic worship. A curious usage that subsisted for a long time in Athenian houses shows us how the slave entered the family. They made him approach the fire, placed him in the presence of the domestic divinity, and poured lustral water upon his head. He then shared with the family some cakes and fruit. This ceremony bore a certain analogy to those of marriage and adoption. It doubtless signified that the newcomer, a stranger the day before, should henceforth be a member of the family and share in its religion. And thus the slave joined in the prayers and took part in the festivals. The fire protected him. The religion of the Lares belonged to him as well as to his master. This is why the slave was buried in the burial place of the family. But by the very act of acquiring this worship and the right to pray, he lost his liberty. Religion was a chain that held him. He was bound to the family for his whole life and after his death. His master could raise him from his base servitude and treat him as a free man, but the servant did not on this account quit the family. As he was bound to it by his worship, he could not without impiety separate from it. Under the name of freedman, or that of client, he continued to recognize the authority of the chief or patron, to be under obligations to him. He did not marry without the consent of the master, and his children continued to obey this master. There was thus formed in the midst of the great family a certain number of small families of clients and subordinates. The Romans attributed the establishment of clientship to Romulus, as if an institution of this nature could not have been the work of a man. Clientship is older than Romulus. Besides, it has existed in other countries, in Greece as well as in all Italy. It was not the cities that established and regulated it. They, on the contrary, as we shall presently see, weakened and destroyed it by degrees. Clientship is an institution of the domestic law, and existed in families before there were cities. We are not to judge of the clientship of earlier ages from the clients that we see in Horace's time. The client, it is clear, was for a long time a servant attached to a patron. But there was then something to give him dignity. He had a part in the worship, and was associated in the religion of the family. He had the same sacred fire, the same festivals, the same sacra as his patron. At Rome, in sign of this religious community, he took the name of the family. He was considered as a member of it by adoption, hence the close bond and reciprocity of duties between the patron and the client. Listen to the old Roman law. If a patron has done his client wrong, let him be accursed, sacer esto, let him die. The patron was obliged to protect his client by all the means and with all the power of which he was master, by his prayers as a priest, by his lance as a warrior,
by his law as a judge. Later, when the client was called before the city tribunal, it was the patron's duty to defend him. It was his duty even to reveal to him the mysterious formulas of the law that would enable him to gain his cause. One might testify in court against a cognate, but not against a client. And men continued long to consider their duties towards clients as far above those towards cognates. Why? Because a cognate connected solely through women was not a relative and had no part in the family religion. The client, on the contrary, had a community of worship. He had, inferior though he was, a real relationship, which consisted, according to the expression of Plato, in adoring the same domestic gods. Clientship was a sacred bond which religion had formed, and which nothing could break. Once the client of a family, one could never be separated from it. Clientship was even hereditary. From all this we see that the family, in the earliest times, with its oldest branch and its younger branches, its servants and its clients, might comprise a very numerous body of men. A family that by its religion maintained its unity, by its private law rendered itself indivisible, and through the laws of clientship retained its servants, came to form in the course of time a very extensive organization, having its hereditary chief. The Aryan race appears to have been composed of an indefinite number of societies of this nature, during a long succession of ages. These thousands of little groups lived isolated, having little to do with each other, having no need of one another, united by no bond religious or political, having each its domain, each its internal government, each its gods.